I'd like to call the meeting to order and start off with a moment of silence to remember our fallen brothers and sisters. Thank you very much. Seems like we just met. Too long ago. All right, looking at our agenda, item number 1 is the approval of our May 2024 minutes. Entertain a motion to adopt.
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded to adopt. Any discussion? Hearing or seeing none. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Minutes are adopted. Thank you very much. I should have said, just so you're aware, we have our group here, but we do have a few people that are joining us virtual. Looks like Mark's online, Tarina's online, Wolf, AJ, and I'm looking to see if Jason's there, but I can't see. He's not yet. Is that everybody, I think, then? So, all right. So we do have a quorum. All right, Mr. Nelson.
Okay. As you know, one of the primary responsibilities of the Left Plan 2 board is to adopt the contribution rates for the plan for the members and the employers and the state. Here to present the results of the most recent Left 2 actuarial valuation are Mitch and Sarah from the actuary's office. Mitch, you've seen present several times before, but I think this is Sarah's first your second presentation to the board. My memory, sorry about that.
She tried to forget.
Yeah. But with that, I'll turn it over to them. This is not a rate adoption, will be in July. But they're here to give you all of the actuarial info that will go into your deliberations on rates next meeting. With that, I'll turn it over to you guys.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the board. For the record, Mitch DeCamp, Office of the State Actuary. I'm joined by Sarah Baker, and we are excited to present to you the 2023 preliminary Left 2 actuarial valuation results. A quick introduction for Sarah. Yes, this is her second presentation to the board. She presented the 2021 valuation results. She was also a key member of the team that developed these valuation results, so happy to have her joining us today. All right, for today's presentation, this is going to be our standard annual valuation presentation that you see us give most years, but we're going to go into a little bit more detail this year because there's a lot that's happened in the valuation this year. Specifically for what we're going to cover, we're going to start out with some background on the valuation cycle, and then we'll get into the valuation results. We're going to cover everything from data all the way through contribution rates. And then Sarah and I are going to split this thing up. She's going to cover through funded status, and then I'll pick up with contribution rates at the end. A couple things to keep in mind. All the results you're going to see today are preliminary. They're still under audit from Milliman. We don't expect them to change, which is why we're comfortable sharing them today, but just know that they could. Also, informational only presentation, no board action needed today. Purpose of today's presentations, share the valuation results, answer your questions, and then any rate adoption would happen at next month's July meeting. All right, and with that, I will pass it over to Sarah.
There we go. All right. Thanks for the introduction. I'm very pleased to be presenting this time in person. So very happy to be here with you all. So I'm going to get us started with the purpose of our valuation. So first and foremost, it's to estimate future benefits to be paid from the plan. This is called a rate setting valuation. It's something that we perform every other year. And as the name implies, a rate setting valuation is used to calculate contribution rates to fund those expected future benefits. This also provides us an opportunity to check the funding progress of the plan and just ensure that the underlying data, assumptions, and methods remain reasonable, and that we're up to date with the most current actuarial standards of practice. So that's the purpose of the valuation. You may be wondering what the process looks like. So in this slide here, we show you a diagram of our valuation process from start to finish. So you start on the left-hand side, moving to the right. We receive census data, so information on the participant members from the Department of Retirement Systems. We receive asset information from DRS and SIB. So we take all of that data and we put it into our valuation model. And then we produce valuation assets and liabilities. Those in turn are used to inform calculated contribution rates under the plan's funding policy. And as Mitch already noted, that those outputs are currently being audited by Milliman. And then we also provide it to you, the Left 2 board, and the Pension Funding Council to help assist with the contribution rate adoption process. So I want to drill down a little bit at the start of this process, the valuation assets. So here we show you how the market value of assets have changed since the prior rate setting valuation 2 years ago. So starting in 2021, the plan had a little bit over $19 billion in plan assets. There's contributions coming into the plan, so that can be members, employers, the state. You have disbursements going out to the plan, so you can think of that as benefit payments to plan annuitants. There's some investment earnings, some other revenue, and then we arrive at the 2022 market value of assets of, again, a little bit over $19 billion. So over the next year, more contributions are coming into the plan. Disbursements are going out. You can see the disbursements the second year, they're a little bit higher. And that's because they include $215 million in lump sum payments made to plan annuitants. And that was a part of the benefit improvement bill. There's some more investment earnings coming into the plan, a little bit higher this second year. The investment return over fiscal year 2023 was about 6.9% compared to a little bit over 0% the prior year. And then also there's funds coming in from the benefit improvement account. That's another component of the benefit improvement bill. Add in a little bit more of other revenue, and we arrive at our June 30th, 2023 market value of about $20.6 billion. So that's the market value of assets. What we use in our valuation, though, to determine calculated contribution rates and funded ratios is the actuarial value of assets. So let me walk you through what those look like. So starting with the purpose, like why do we use an actuarial value of assets? Why don't we just use the market value? So the reason why we calculate this measurement for use in our valuation is it helps limit some of the volatility of investment returns on calculated contribution rates and funded ratios. And the way it works is we look at the investment returns that we expected to come into the plan. Currently, that's 7%. We look at what actually occurred, and then we take that difference and we defer that difference over some time period into the future. So right now, the plan has two different deferrals. One is from fiscal year 2022, and that's a investment loss. So it was less than our expected investment returns. And then in 2021, we're deferring an investment gain because the returns were higher than we expected. And that investment loss and gain, they're going to go hand in hand over the next 5 years. In total, it adds up to about $1.3 billion in assets being deferred. That equates to about 6% of total assets. So when we're calculating contribution rates, when we're calculating the funded status, essentially we're ignoring about 6% of total plan assets. So that's how it's calculated, but to give you a better sense of what this looks like, On this next slide here, we show you a history of both the actuarial value of assets, that's that line in green, as well as the market value of assets in blue. You can see over this timeline, the market value is above the actuarial value of assets. However, if you look at a longer time period, these two lines, they weave in and out of each other. And you can see that that green line, the actuarial value of assets, it's much smoother. And you can kind of get a sense for how that smoothness contributes to limiting some of the volatility in market returns on calculated contribution rates. So as I previously mentioned, as of our valuation date, the plan is deferring a little under $1.3 billion in deferred asset gains. So those are the plan assets. So on the other side of the coin, we have plan liabilities. And that's informed by the participant data. So on this slide here, we show you a snapshot of some active and annuitant information. On the active side, you can see that the head counts actually decreased from 2021 to 2022. And then we saw a rebound the following year. In terms of the annuitants, there was a steady increase in headcounts over the 2-year period. I just want to note a couple items that had a material impact on our valuation results. The first one is regarding salary increases. When I say salary increases, it's just a change in salary. It can also be thought of as salary inflation, salary growth. We use all these terms interchangeably for valuation purposes. And it can be due to a number of different sources. It can be due to inflationary pressures. It can be due to promotions, overtime. So all of those different factors play into the single salary growth that we observe. So over fiscal year 2022 and 2023, those salary increases were higher than we were expecting. On average, salaries increased by 6% annually. If you look at members who were working both at the beginning of the year and the end of the year, their salaries increased more around 10% annually. And that's in comparison to about 4.5% to what we would expect. And I did want to note that these salary increases are higher than we expected, but more recently, this is something that we've seen across all of the retirement systems. It may be due to staff recruitment and retention, inflationary pressures. This recent experience, however, is not unique to just Left Plan 2. Another component that had a material impact to our valuation results, to a lesser degree, but still worth noting, is new retirements were higher than expected. So over fiscal year 2022, the number of annuitants increased by 14% and then about 10% in fiscal year 2023. That equates to about 1,900 new retirements. We were expecting something closer to 1,200 over that 2-year period. So those two components had an impact on our valuation result. The third component worth mentioning is a methodology change that we implemented this year. As you all know, inflation has been unusually high recently. So we made a change to the way we model future cost of living adjustments. And I'm going to go over some information. It might be a refresher for some of you, but just bear with me. So Left Plan 2 COLAs, they're based on inflation. They're based on the change in CPI, but they're capped at 3%. And any excess above the 3% is banked for future use. You can see in the table to the right there that if somebody was retired over the past 3 years, their total bank is about 10%, so pretty high. As a comparison, we assume that inflation in the future is 2.75%. That's the adopted inflation assumption. So when we're looking to the future, we would assume 2.75% inflation, but then there's also this 10% extra banking. So in order to reflect this in our evaluation model, we assume that all annuitants, as of our measurement date, will receive 3% COLAs in the future. When we model future new annuitants, so you can think of that as somebody who's maybe still working, they haven't yet retired, we continue to assume that they will receive 2.75% COLAs in the future, consistent with our assumption, because they don't have any banking, they haven't been retired. So all of that information, the participant data, the methodology changes, that all feeds into our liability calculation. So here we show you how the liabilities have changed since the last rate setting valuation. So we show you the present value of future benefits. So that is today's value of all future expected benefits for current members. We also show you the accrued liability, which is the today's value of all future plan benefits that have already been earned or accrued. We use the present value of future benefits to inform contribution rate calculations, whereas the accrued liability figure is used to inform our funded status and funded ratio measurements. Okay, so liabilities by themselves, they don't tell you much of a story. But when you compare them to plan assets, then you can get a measurement of plan health. So here we show you the funded ratio of the plan. We kind of use the term funded ratio and funded status interchangeably. For our purposes, you can think of them as the same thing. And it's simply the actuarial value of assets divided by the accrued liabilities in the plan. 2 years ago, we were measuring the funded status at 104%. And the way you could interpret that is that there's $1.04 of plan assets for every $1 of earned benefits. So moving forward into the future, the liabilities are increasing each year, the assets are increasing each year. Moving from 2022 to 2023, we see that the liabilities are increasing a little bit faster than the assets, and that causes the funded status to decline by about 2%.
Sir.
Oh.
Looking at this, and I think you've said it already, I just want to make sure I'm tracking the same. This is 2003 funded status is at 102%, but that does not include the deferred asset gains, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so that is money that's still setting off to the side that's in the pension fund, correct?
Yeah, you got it.
Okay.
Good question. And you may be wondering why that funded status declined over the 2-year period. So I show you a breakdown here. So over the 2-year period, we're recognizing past deferred gains. As we just mentioned, there's still some out there to be recognized in the future. So you can kind of get a sense for how this may look going forward as well. But over the past 2 years, recognizing those deferred asset gains have increased the funded status by about 2.5%. On the other hand, plan experience has led to a decline of about 3% annually. Most of that is due to the higher than expected salary increases. It makes up about 2/3 of that 3%. And then over this most recent year, we also have our methodology change for COLA banking, which led to an additional decline of about 1.5% of the funded status. All right, so that wraps up the plan health measurements. Before I pass it off to Mitch to talk about calculated contribution rates, just want to pause again, see if there's any more questions.
Any questions? Go ahead, Tor.
Um, um, Board Chair, not AG, not on the board, just for clarification. But the COLA banking modeling change, I'm just curious, did you make that change for all plans? That
Yes,
was really I just want to make sure I heard that right.
yes, all of the plans are eligible for the banking. We made it for all of the
Great.
plans.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Much appreciated. Thank you.
Welcome. I'll follow up on that, the banking piece of it. I was looking at the numbers for annuitants. And our head count for 2023 was 9,400 for the annuitants. I'm sorry, annuitants. Yeah, got it. And so is that the piece that you're using? Is that the model that has changed, that those individuals will be forecasted for the 3% from here on out?
Yes, that's correct.
Correct.
Mhm.
And then the 2.75 is for everybody else.
Yes, absolutely. You got it.
And then the other question I had was related to, and I think you did cover this, I wrote it down, was the salary increases, because you did acknowledge the CPI adjustment. Because most of our fire service and our police service work off contracts, and our labor agreements follow sometimes CPI. So, you know, we're in a contract year, let's say from 2021 through 2024. We start negotiations sometime in 24. We've had increases, but you could have been at the bargaining table at the last previous contract, and you may have agreed to, let's say, 3, 3, and 3. And if CPI was high, you may have not had the opportunity to capture that, so you go to the bargaining table trying to catch up. So now you're asking for a higher increase in 2025, you know, which would be greater than CPI. Do you follow that at all? I mean, because if CPI is high one year and we're not there, and we try to catch up, is it a balance at some point? Does it come together?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways that we determine our expectations for the future. So we perform a economic experience study where we look at uh, salary increases more akin to inflationary pressures, and then real wage growth. And then we also do a demographic experience study, and that's something that we'll be starting this fall, where we look at increases to salary growth due to merit increases, promotion, things like that. When we perform evaluation, we do consider collective bargaining agreements that's out there. Unfortunately, there's not like a cohesive document that we can look at to determine, like in the short term, this is how salaries are going to perform. And our valuation is really meant to be more of a long-term model of the plan. So we don't, at least for this valuation, we didn't make any sort of adjustment for short-term expectations, aside from the assumptions that we already have in place.
Questions? Oh, go ahead, Representative.
Question about the banking. If the legislator were to contemplate changing banking, have you already kind of run models around what different policy changes might look like and what impacts it would have on retirement plans for funded status?
Yeah, we've heard those ideas floating out there. We have not yet priced what those impacts would look like. I guess the short answer is no, we have not. If a bill were to be introduced, bill language, or if it's something that the committee, or excuse me, the board is pursuing, that's something that we may end up estimating in the future.
Mr. Nelson.
Yeah, the board put COLA banking on the interim work plan. I believe at this point in time, we're tentatively scheduling that for a presentation in September. We may not have any specific pricing available, certainly won't for September. But one of the things that we're trying to work out with the actuary's office, like you heard earlier in the presentation, there's like 10.1% banked if you just very non-actuarially, very low level math, you multiply 10.1% by all of your retiree liabilities, which are currently right around 19 billion, you get a rough idea that you might be talking about, you're talking about a big number, 1.9 billion. Obviously, that's not precise, and we'll work on getting something better. The specifics, like a proposal, that would pricing any kind of thing like, well, what if you raise the bank or the COLA to 4% a year or something like that? We'd have to come up with some bill language, and some pricing on something like that wouldn't be available maybe until December. But at least we're hoping to give you an idea at some point in time in this interim about how much is in the bank. Again, high level math, they've been assuming 2.75%. Now that you've got 10% in the bank, that would take 40 years for that bank to get exhausted if you're just looking at the difference between 3% and 2.75. So the current bank, if you will, banking model was not really designed to keep up with a spike in inflation like we really experienced.
Questions? Senator?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. These are just out of curiosity, I think, more than utility at this point. When you, on slide 7, page 4, you show the average annual salary in 2023 is 136.6. That, I'm curious, obviously it's not a modality. Is that a median scatter plotting? Is that a truly a mean average where you have chiefs and rookies salaries just all added and divided? Something simple as a mean averaging.
Yeah,
Wow.
that's simple.
So this is maybe not truly a central scatter plot like a median averaging would show where the real money is, correct? The real salary level is for the guy that's been on 10 years, where can patrol this kind of thing.
Yeah, it would likely look a little bit different if you looked at the median or the distribution of salaries. And I'll also note that these average salaries, like you noted, they include new entrants to the plan. They include new employees, which are going to have a lower salary than your more seasoned employees. And that's one of the reasons why the salary increases we saw for people who were working both at the beginning and the end of the year are higher than just the simple average salary increase annually.
Fair enough. Oh, follow up on that, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
So I've been on the board since 2005, and it seems like forever we've had an increase in average age for members in this system here. I know I'm seeing a decrease. It's declining at this point. Is that a function of simple demographics going forward from here, or is that something that that maybe our benefit enhancement distribution? Do you have any insight or the why as to that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I don't know if I have a single answer to that. It's not something that we study, but if I were to make some assumptions about what might be happening, is we did see higher than expected retirements, like I noted. So people that are retiring, they tend to have a higher average age. Going from 2022 to 2023, there's a lot of new members in the system, a lot of new hires. They tend to be younger, right? So that might be contributing to why the average age is declining in the plan rather than increasing. And it may revert going forward once the hiring process has stabilized a little bit more. I will say over this 2-year period, it also encompassed the Great Resignation. And we did see that decline in active membership followed by a bounce back.
Sure.
Thank you. So at 100,000 feet, I know Mitch smiles at me like everybody else does. What the hell's he next? So if you have an increasing age, there's a trend as to a funding status that would come because you've got a large number of people, or an average age is increasing over a period of time. If you have an average age is declining, does that have some sort of a trend or an impact in the future, say 10 years out, that would be different than you'd have from an increasing average age versus a declining average age?
Yeah, it certainly has an impact to the plan. I wouldn't necessarily expect that average age to continue to decline over time, but the overall maturity of the plan, the age of the annuitants, it can influence the overall risk of the plan, the funding of the plan, right? Because, for example, if you have a newer employee, they're going to be working, or younger employee, I should say, they're going to be working longer. There's more time to make adjustments to contributions. Whereas an older employee near retirement, there may not be as much time to make any sort of adjustments or changes. So we see a different risk profile depending on how the plan looks. But I don't expect any dramatic swings in average age for left plan 2, but that's something that we look at when we produce projections for the future.
Yeah, I can add to that briefly. Lisa and I gave a presentation, I believe it was a couple years ago, where we looked at actually a projection of the average age of active members for Left 2. And we saw it increasing to this point, and then it sort of stabilized where the people coming into the plan offset the people exiting the plan. Obviously, the pandemic happened, and now we're in this sort of state of flux right now, where we're actually seeing a decrease in the average age. Where are we going to go from here? Hard to say. My guess is we probably head towards, probably more towards where we saw in that projection, where the average age will probably steady out at some point.
We got Wolf online. Wolf, go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you. A quick question about your slide 11, I believe it is, where you compare and look at funded status. Yeah, there you go. It looks to me, looking at it, the main reason for the difference between 21-22 and 22-23 is the model change. To get
Yes.
comparable, is there a way to backcast a model change for the 21-22 period? Or to just take it out of the calculation? Because right now it looks almost like you're measuring temperature in one case, temperature and wind chill in the other case. So it's a little bit apples to oranges. And then showing the valuation change over time.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm completely following the question.
Had you not made the modeling change, which is a modeling change, not a inputs, facts, or analytic change, it's a modeling change, we would not have seen a measured funded status change of 101.7%. You would have seen something closer to 103.5%.
Yes, that's correct. You could you can just add in that 1.5% back to see where you would have arrived at if we hadn't made that methodology change.
So again, I'm just asking because it could be made to look like we're seeing some overall declines in valuation, when in fact what we're doing is really observing the effect of the modeling change.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's correct, Wolf. I think it's good to keep in mind that with every valuation, we are reassessing all the methods and assumptions that we're using, and we've observed some high levels of inflation. So we added that COLA Bank modeling change in there, and it had an impact on the funded status of 1.5%. I think you also mentioned what happened if we would have moved that COLA Bank modeling change back a valuation, say reflected it in the 2022 valuation. Probably would have had a similar impact, probably close to 1.5% as well, maybe a little bit less because there's fewer annuitants at that time. But yeah, I mean, we're trying to, in this table, distill for you guys the three major impacts that changed funded status, and those are the big three right there, and then trying to give you a sense with the actual finding an estimate for what the actual funded status change was, so you kind of have a sense for the magnitude of it as well.
Thank you.
Other questions? Good.
So the plan experience from 2021 and 2023, how much of that, you mentioned, the Great Resignation and some of this salary growth that may or may not be driven in part by the recent inflation. Do you have any estimates or projections about whether that negative plan experience is likely to continue into the future?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we set our assumptions for the future. So when we set those assumptions, we're on a deterministic basis. We're not assuming anything's going to deviate from those assumptions in the future. We all know that our assumptions will be wrong. We've produced in the fall. We produce stochastic analysis. We provide sensitivity analysis in our report to give you some sense for how the results may look different when the future looks different than what we assumed. But could there be negative plan experience going forward in the future? It's hard to say. It might be that, in the future we see the opposite impacts where we have plan experience that leads to increases in the funded status, say if salary increases decline below our expectations, or that might, we might see, again, negative plan experience. It really just depends on what happens in the future and how it matches with our assumptions.
Good.
Would have asked my question better because you answered earlier, you're not changing any of your long-term assumptions. So those are long-term based on the short-term experience. I was kind of I'm wrestling with one of the comments Pat made earlier about salary growth in left 2 tends to be tied to contracts. And so for lack of a better word, maybe not all of the bad news in terms of salary growth being higher than expected has been recognized yet as contracts come up over the next 2-3 years and start trying to capture some of that past CPI loss. You don't have any kind of modeling or anything that you look into short-term experience type projections like that?
No, we do not. I think this is actually one of those circumstances where the board probably has more insight than we do on where salaries are going. But no, we do not have that information. I will say, as I shared earlier, for a member, we expect about a 4.5% increase in salary. So if you think that it's above 4.5% based on what you've been seeing, then it's likely that it'll have a negative impact on in terms of plan experience going forward.
Steve, briefly, I will note, yes, we are not changing any of our long-term assumptions right now because the assumptions we set are long-term in nature because pension obligations are long-term. This is also the benefit of having annual evaluations and having rate setting every 2 years, is that we're going to redo evaluation next year. We're going to redo evaluation the year after that, and we're going to see the impact of that experience as it plays through the system. So thankfully, pensions are not funded as a one-time forever determine the rate of the plan. you get to readjust as that experience plays through the system. So, yes, salaries could be higher or they could be lower as some of that salary growth maybe gets pulled forward, but future valuations will show that.
Patrick?
Yes. So Sarah, this is your second time in front of the board?
It is. Yeah, I was virtual the first time,
Are you having
so
fun yet?
I'm enjoying sharing what I worked on for a long time.
With all that said, so I think I have it correct. The way that you do your analysis, you look at the CPI, you look at, the CPI, and what you see in the way of contributions coming in and what we need to do to adjust. So you are on what the numbers that you see. And I think, Matt, you just made the point is as a board, we see maybe things that they're different. One of the things I think we've talked about already is salary increases. The CPI goes up 9%. You guys use that number to figure out what the rates are going to be, where we know that there's contracts out there that may only allow 4% or less for the next 3 years. So that creates it. And then because of the pandemic and everything else that was going on, a lot of people retired, people left the positions, but they still had to be filled. And so that's filled by overtime and mandatory overtime, which increases salaries for a short period of time until everything levels out again. And those numbers are not included. And all you do is you see the spike. You don't think that the spike is going to go away. That's the numbers that you project from that point forward, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Well said.
Who said that?
I just commented, well said. That was a good explanation.
Don't do that, Mitch.
I know I shouldn't. I tried to stop myself.
I know, you just can't.
I got another question.
See? Oh, strike that from the record. Yeah. All right. Other questions? All right. Thank you.
All right, so we are finally moving on to contribution rates. Before we get to the new contribution rates, I want to quickly review the currently adopted rates. Those are in the table on this slide. For members, employers, and the state, the board adopted those for the 2023-25 and the 2025 biennia using your 4-year rate adoption policy. Jacob covered this last month, but that's essentially where the board will adopt for a 4-year instead of a 2-year period. You can still update the rates in the second half of that 4-year period. You're not stuck with it just because you adopted it using that policy. So where did these rates come from? They are from the contribution rate cap from the Benefit Improvement Bill. That's SHB 1701. When the board reviewed the 2021 valuation, those rates exceeded the rate cap. So you took the rate cap and adopted the rate cap for the next 4 years. In the teal box on this slide, I have the actual rate adoption motion language. In addition to adopting contribution rates, you included language to reassess the 2025-27 rates with the results of the 2023 valuation and the funding policy from the Benefit Improvement Bill. And that's where we are today. So any rate adoption that's going to come from the 2023 valuation will be at the board's meeting next month. Okay, so that is the current adopted contribution rates, where they are right now. Now we're going to get into the new contribution rates. Fair warning, I'm going to cover things in a little bit more detail than I usually do. I think it's important. I think it's important that the board hears this to understand how contribution rates are moving. There's no quiz at the end except for Pat. Pat has to take the quiz at the end. Not expecting you to remember every detail while we're going through it. But feel free to ask questions. You can follow up with me after the presentation. And if you're just not getting it, that's totally fine too. I have a nice summary slide at the end that boils it all down to brass tacks. There we go. We're back on track now. Starting with some background on contribution rates. There are 2 sets of contribution rates we calculate for every valuation. And that's because these 2 contribution rates support 2 funding goals for the board. Those funding goals are adequacy in contribution rates, ensuring that contribution rates can fully fund the plan obligations, and stability in contribution rates, limiting volatility or variance in rates between valuations. And then each of these rates that we calculate supports one of those funding goals, either adequacy or stability. The final rate then for the valuation is the greater of those two rates that we calculate. Okay, so let's actually talk about the rates. The first set of rates is the aggregate rate. These are the rates for the adequacy funding goal. Aggregate rates come from a full actuarial cost method. The aggregate rates are set in statute for the plan. It's the actuarial cost method for all of the state retirement systems, actually. Aggregate rates are adequate rates because they fully fund the plan obligations over the working careers of current members. Essentially, they're funding towards 100% funded status. Some of the issues we see with aggregate rates, well, there tends to be some volatility in the rates. And that's because the rate fluctuates both with plan experience and changes in assets. So to help control some of that volatility or variance, that's where the minimum rates come in. And the minimum rates are supportive of the goal of stability in contribution rates. These minimum rates are calculated from the normal cost of the entry age normal cost method. That's a mouthful, so you typically see it abbreviated as EANC. And the note there is that that is just one piece of a full actuarial cost method. And that's because that piece is very stable between valuations and supports the minimum rates in their goal of being a stability component. The rub there is that it's just one component of a full actuarial cost method, so there's no guarantee that those rates can fully fund the plan obligations. A few more notes on the minimum rates. They are broken up into tiers based on funded status. Jacob covered this in his presentation last month. I'll review it shortly in a couple slides. And then the minimum rates can experience sharp changes when moving between tiers. That's just the nature of the calculation. And then new this year is the offset rate that's coming in with this valuation based on the requirements of the benefit improvement bill. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a couple slides as well. All right, that's the background on contribution rates, the aggregate rate, the minimum rate, and the two board funding goals of adequacy in contribution rates and stability in contribution rates. I mentioned aggregate rates. I mentioned some of the volatility or variance in aggregate rates. So let's see where that comes from. In this table, I'm showing the member aggregate rate. So the top bolded figure in the table, 8.65%, that's the member aggregate rate for the 2021 valuation. I'm just showing member rates for simplicity. Employers in the state obviously contributed as well, 60 and 40% respectively. And then the three items that impacted aggregate rates are the three same items that Sarah covered in her funded status section. A, it's the 2022 and 2023 investment returns and recognizing those past gains. That decreased aggregate rates. Item B is the plan experience, those salary changes and some retirement experience, those increased the aggregate rates, and then that COLA bank modeling change that increased the aggregate rates as well. So adding all those up, you get to the 2023 valuation aggregate rates of 9.39%. So typically what we see with aggregate rates is it moves the opposite of funded status. So things that increase funded status will decrease the aggregate rate. I want to also draw your attention to to the size of some of those components in A, B, and C. Those are some pretty sizable changes in the aggregate rates for just a 2-year period and really showcases how much variability there can be in the aggregate rates between valuations. So to help control some of that volatility or variance, that's where the minimum rates come in. Let's take a look at the minimum rates. Before we get to the numbers on this, quick review of the policy and then the components. Top portion of the table are the minimum rate tiers. Jacob covered this in his presentation, so we'll just breeze through it here. Left column of the table shows those funded status triggers that moves between the minimum rate tiers, split by funded status less than 105%, in between 105 and 110, and then greater than 110%. In the right column of the table is the actual minimum rate calculation that we would do for that specific tier of minimum rates, and it's varying percentages of the EANC minus the offset rate. And generally what we see is as you move up in funded status, move up in those tiers of minimum rates, the minimum rates come down. So let's briefly talk about the components because that's important to understanding how these minimum rates are moving as well. EANC, that's that normal cost under the entry age normal cost method. Note there is it's pretty stable between valuations and it doesn't change with the level of plan assets. The offset rate, that's new this year. That's intended to reduce minimum rates so they did not increase for current members from the benefit improvement bill. If you think back to the benefit improvement bill, that increased the EANC. That bill also moved the benefit improvement account assets into the left to trust. The EANC doesn't change with the level of plan assets. So the offset rate was included. So the total minimum rate didn't increase as a result of the benefit improvement. Bill, the benefit improvement bill also told OSA to calculate the offset rate with whatever assumptions and methods we determined appropriate. We calculated a 0.75% reduction and applying for 15 years. All right, that's the policy and the components. Let's look at the actual numbers. Pretty simple calculation. Let's start with the 2023 valuation column. First bolded number there is funded status. Check on the funded status for the plan to determine what tier of minimum rates we're in. That's the first tier of minimum rates. So it's 100% of the EANC and 100% of the offset rate. So the minimum rate, A minus B, and we get to the final minimum rate of 9.22%. Same process repeated for the 2021 valuation, but the offset rate was not part of the 2021 valuation. So you actually see a decrease. In the minimum rates going from the 2021 to the 2023 valuation. If those 2023 rates aren't looking that familiar, that's because when the board reviewed the 2021 val, the rate cap was still in effect, so you couldn't even use those rates if you had wanted to. I want to also highlight the 100% EANC component. Look how stable that is between valuations. 9.94% for 2021, 9.97% for 2023. A lot happened in the plan. Investment experience, salaries, inflation, some retirement experience, but the EANC only changed by 3 basis points. And that's why it is such a good component for use in the minimum rates, because the point of the minimum rates is to fulfill your stability goal in contribution rates. All right, now we're going to finally put it all together, and I swear this is my last slide with A, B's, and C's on it because I'm sure it's driving you crazy. Looking at the 2023 column, again, going down to the first bolded number, or the calculated rate, it's the larger of the aggregate or the minimum rate. That's according to the funding policy. So 9.39% using the aggregate rate. Item C, rates for recent legislation. That's legislation that's not yet included in our valuation software, so it's not yet part of the aggregate rate or the minimum rate. That was 0.04% or 4 basis points. That was for interruptive military service credit and the omnibus bill. So adding the calculated rate to C, we get to the final rate for the 2023 valuation of 9.43%. Same process we did for the 2021 valuation. Final rate there was 9.94%. So there you have it. You've survived. You've gotten through all of the contribution rate calculation, the background, the aggregate rate, the minimum rate. I have a nice summary slide and some closing things on contribution rates. But before I do, questions on how we're calculating these rates, the impact of some of the components before we get to that, get to those closing thoughts.
Questions? Like we got an online or a phone call. It's okay. I have a question for you.
Sure.
So, and I apologize because you may have touched on this. So what happens to the deferrals under these models? Is it just completely taken out of the equation?
You got it. Yeah. So that's how the closed valuations are done. You strictly rely on the actuarial value of assets. And then in future valuations, pieces of those deferred assets are recognized. And in theory, they would bring down contribution rates in the future. So why use deferrals at all. Well, the whole point of asset smoothing is that typically investment experience is volatile. And when we see large investment returns or small investment returns that differs from the expected return, there can usually be some offsetting returns. And we actually saw that over the last couple of years. The plan had a 31% return and then a 0% return the next year. So asset smoothing says, hey, that return is really good. Recognize that slowly over time because there's likely some offsetting effects coming down the road. But if there is no offsetting effects, that will just go to reducing contribution rates in the future and increasing funded status.
I think you may have touched on it. I know Mark's online. One of the main goals, was the plan stability, and you had talked about the aggregate rate being more volatile
Mhm.
and our minimum rates having more stability.
Yep.
And the overall objective, I think, from the board going back to its inception was to have plan stability that helped with the employees, employers, as well as the state.
Mhm.
If we take the deferral out of the equation, but then use it in the future, is it potentially that we would raise them up and then come back down again?
Yeah, for sure, there is the potential of that yes, if plan experience is close to the plan assumptions or plan experience is positive, yes, you could raise rates based on this valuation and then rates could come down in the future. The converse side of that is that if plan experience is negative and offsets those deferred gains like we saw in this valuation, contribution rates in the future could be larger.
Representative, go ahead.
So I just want to be clear, the deferral is treated differently than the COLA assumption because the 2.75 was assumed it could be higher some years and could be lower some years, but now you're actually taking that into account. So how does that differ? Why one you're taking into account now and the other one, the deferrals are treated?
Yeah, good question. So it's all a matter of what experience is smoothed and not smoothed. According to the funding policies of the plan, only asset experience is smoothed. Assumption experience isn't smoothed and, plan experience isn't smoothed like salaries or retirement experience, and then changes in assumptions aren't smoothed as well.
Yes, please go ahead.
But the assumption isn't changed, 2.75 ongoing, which means we could have a couple of years of 0% inflation that would bring this back to like, so just seems like more factored into this COLA assumption than,
Yeah,
it's just interesting.
yeah. So we are assuming 3% right now. As Steve mentioned, the assumption is 2.75%. If you have 10% in the bank and you only get to use 0.25% a year, it's going to be a lot of years before you run through that bank. Correct. Yeah, absolutely. Again, that is the benefit of annual valuations. We see a couple years of 0, and that assumption could change in the future. Always with every valuation, we're reviewing all of the assumptions and methods and trying to, at that measurement date, come up with the best assumption of plan costs that we can. And for this valuation, that included changing the COLA assumption for current annuitants because of their large bank.
Patrick?
Mitch? Okay, let me make sure I understand. Right now, we've adopted, or we have the adopted rates for members at 8.53%.
Correct.
And are we looking at raising it to 9.43?
9.43 is what's coming out of this valuation. Whatever the board decides to do is your decision.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to my previous questions and observations. Is that so? Dennis made the comment, and I've been here long enough to be before we had the board. Why we created the board and what we're doing here today is that we have $1.3 billion in deferred assets.
Mhm.
We have spiking in overtime and cost of living, which some people call salary increases. Well, those things are smooth. Most of the things that we do here is smooth, so we don't go back to the roller coaster. And what I just heard is that we're suggesting an increase, but in 2 years, we may have a decrease. And Representative Berquist made a very good point, is that if there's 0 cost of living, then they would drop, where we have the money to protect ourselves for the next contribution increase. And one of the things that we've always tried to do is stay away from the roller coaster and continue with the smoothing. And you're showing us numbers that say, this is what we suspect. But for the last 20 years, what this board has been doing with the smoothing has worked out pretty well in what we're doing. So I guess that's what I'm looking at is I don't want to get back on the roller coaster. And I sit here now as an employer. And the idea is that I'm a firm believer in if you raise the rates, to drop the rates is crazy. Because what it does is it gives you that false sense of security. And I have a chief that gives me a budget. And the $100 that my member has to pay is one thing, or my firefighter that has to pay. That's, you double that by 300 to 400 people. And then that affects our budget, and that we didn't need to do because we're still overfunded, or we're at 101% or 103% on which way you want to look at it. And so I understand your numbers. You have to look at numbers. That's what you look at. The contracts and the other things that we deal with to smooth it is something that we do. Would it be appropriate? So if we kept it at 8.53, would that, and the board decides that's what we're going to do. We loved your numbers, but no, we're going to go with ours. Is that a problem?
Yeah, so a lot to unpack there. Let me just talk.
Go for the big one.
Yeah,
Problem.
yeah. Let me just talk about, these sort of competing goals of adequacy and stability. And also, let me just clarify that we just are calculating the rates for every valuation based on the funding policy, the assumptions you adopt, show you what the rates are.
Mhm.
Your decision on rates is for you as the board to make. We as your actuaries take no position on what rates you should adopt. So yeah, you have these competing goals. Adequacy on one side, the 9.43%. If you just focused on adequacy, that would suggest, all right, jump to 9.43%. But as you said, the downside of focusing just on adequacy is that you could have volatility. We've seen how volatile the aggregate rates can be. They tend to react quickly to plan experience. We know the plan is still deferring investment gains. On the other side, you have your stability goal. If you focus just on stability, that could suggest leaving the rates exactly where they're at 8.53%. The plan is still deferring about $1.3 billion in deferred investment gains, and we would expect contribution rates to come down as those deferred gains are recognized. I thought I might get this question, so I took a look at an estimate for the 2025 valuation. What that would be recognizing 2 more years of deferred investment gains. That aggregate rate drops to about 8.7%. All right, the minimum rate still stays higher, about 9.25%, because it stays higher about where we calculated it now, because it doesn't go down until you get into that next tier of minimum rates. But aggregate rate, that's what's necessary to fully fund the plan obligations, and that's at 8.7%.
Good. Now, you mentioned it. We have aggregate rate and we have minimum rate. One is in statute.
Both are in statute.
Yeah, and this board has the ability to set the rates.
I will defer to Steve on that comment.
Okay.
Yes, the board sets the rate.
Yeah.
So with all that said, I appreciate the representation and the presentation, but at the same time, I was here when we did the roller coaster and it was never any fun. And I appreciate your numbers, but I think if we take the overall look at what we're looking at, the fund is well valued. I like the idea we're looking at the numbers, but I think there's some issues that as we move forward, I think if the numbers give us pause, but I still believe that this board is, and rate smoothing is better than rates roller coasting. And I'm not saying that's what you're suggesting, but that's what I'm always afraid of getting into, which we had to deal with before. So, Mitch, I appreciate it.
Pat, I take no offense if you
Thank
do
you.
not adopt these rates exactly as.
I will tell you when I'm really offended. How's that?
Okay, that
Rate
sounds-
adoption will be in July, and so
Right.
the board, again, you guys haven't had this level of complexity, for lack of a better word, in your rate adoption decisions for quite some time. The introduction of the minimum rate exceeding the aggregate rate exceeding the minimum rate is kind of added in a new wrinkle, for lack of a better word. We'll come back with several different options for you in July taking into account stability and taking into account full funding, and then we'll be prepared to kind of talk with you about the pros and cons of each of those different options, the risks associated with those different options.
Go ahead, Daryl.
When you were back on slide number 8, you said that there was an approximate COLA bank of 10.1. Where do we go to check our balance in that bank? How did you come up with the approximate? That's just just what the COLA was and then what we had given. Is there a specific number that we would know for certain, or that you could find for certain that would give us that actual?
Yeah, I think what you're asking for is like the individual COLA bank, like by member. Is that what you're after?
Well, not necessarily by member, but by the plan. How much is there? And I understand the differences that, of when you retired and such, but there's got to be a better number than just like an approximate.
Yeah, so yeah, good question. So we don't get the actual like COLA bank amount from DRS. When we're modeling COLAs, we're doing a more simplified approach. Hey, applying this 3% for everybody, applying 2.75% for all future retirees. DRS is the one that actually administers and calculates that COLA by every member, and then gives them increases in their benefit. So that information would have to come from DRS.
We'll see what we can get as far as more specific numbers for the COLA presentation that you guys get in September.
That bank would also have an impact if we, going into the deferred investments.
Yeah.
Returns.
At the last meeting, for instance, Sean mentioned that DRS tracks that bank by individual member with a dollar amount. So it's possible that with enough time and running a data request, we might be able to get something more specific for you in September, but we'll find out.
Okay, thank you.
Mitch, question for you. I know you haven't hit your final contribution rate slide. I think it's right there.
Yeah.
The number 3.77 for the state, is that correct? Their portion? I think it's on the next one. I'm sorry, I'm on page 8.
That's all right. We're ready to move on.
Yeah. That one right there. What does that increase? What is that number? What is that dollar value?
Like the approximate dollar value that the state would contribute under that contribution.
For the difference, what would that cost the state?
I'm sorry, I don't have those. I don't have those numbers. I can try to come up with our estimate and share that with you though.
If you could, if it crossed the line, I think it's curious. I'm just curious to know what that looks like. Sure. It's always good to know how much something's going to cost.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other questions? Online? Go ahead, Representative.
Would that rate be calculated by multiplying like the number of employees by like their average salary by the 0.26?
Yes, it would be. Yeah, that 3.77 would apply to, yes, the salary that's collected over, and that's how you'd come up with the total amount of contributions that would come from the state.
Other questions? Okay.
All right. Final contribution rates, kind of hit on all of this stuff, but here's a nice summary table and slide. If you needed it, in the contribution rate table, there's the current adopted rates on the top for members, employers, and the state. And then there's those key 2023 valuation figures, boiling it all down. Funded status, about 102%. Contribution rates based on aggregate, and there the rates are for members, employers, and the state. In the text below the table, those are the recap of the primary elements that impacted contribution rates. It's the three same things we've been talking about for most of this presentation. Those higher than expected salaries for active members, higher than expected inflation that is leading to the higher expected cost of living adjustments in the future, and then recognizing those past deferred gains that actually lowered contribution rates, but on balance, the first two items were larger than the last, and contribution rates went up. So yeah, we covered it, a little bit in Q&A there with Pat, but yeah, you guys will have to decide how you want to balance adequacy in contribution rates and stability in contribution rates. And there's pros and cons on both sides. As I mentioned with the stability comment, that there are deferred gains out there, and we would expect those deferred gains to lower contribution rates in the future. But the big if there is if plan experience is close to the plan assumptions. And if plan experience is not close to the plan assumptions, that's the risk of keeping contribution rates low. The future plan experience offsets those deferred gains. Higher contribution rates are necessary, and then missed contribution rates would need to be repaid along with missed investment earnings. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge to figure out how you want to balance these competing goals of adequacy and stability. All right, happy to take in additional questions.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
I think my fast math did about $7 million would be the increase. I don't know if that's,
Look at that big brain.
I don't do math while I'm in the middle of a presentation.
no, that's good. I appreciate it. The, just the long-term impact. So it sounds like we've got a 2-year rate already kind of in place that we could revisit. But generally what we've done in the past is set the outlook rate is kind of generally what we do. Is that right, Steve? I kind of recall a 4-year kind of plan usually.
It depends. So off the top of my head, I'll just throw out some options that are consistent with what you've done in the past. And maybe ask for your advice, because typically we try to only sort things down when it's simpler to like 3 options, so it's not super complicated. I don't know how you would feel, if you would feel like you were being better served or worse served if you had 6 options at the next board meeting. But one of the options obviously is to leave the rates that you've adopted for the next biennium alone. That's always been one of the options, and it will still be. Yeah.
And sometimes we do take into account like legislation.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah, which in this case would be those 4 basis points. The other possibility that you've done in the past is when rates were going up, and this goes back to prior to 2008, so it's been a while for some of the members of the board since you've had to kind of deal with that. All of your members are local government, and local governments tend to do annual budgeting. So the last time rates were going up, there was a stair step up, and it was an annual stair step. So you kind of gradually moved up to what the new target rate is. In this case, that new target rate could be the ag rate that you see presented. It could be that new minimum rate that Mitch talked about in an earlier slide, which would be 9.2%. So there's several different possibilities. But like, for instance, what you're talking about, maybe one of the options would be leave the rate alone for 2 years. See how much more bad news you've got in salaries coming your way, how much more negative experience you have compared to the deferred gains, and then adjust in 2 years. Or you could start phasing in some kind of adjustment now, maybe phase it in second biennium only, but maybe also one of the options would be if you were adjusting things, if you were going to move away from the 8.5 now, what would be a number that would make sense? We'll try to, and even though they won't be presenting, the actuaries will be available to answer questions in July. But obviously there's a lot of different moving pieces in rate setting this year. This will be an unusually complicated rate setting cycle for the board. You haven't had this many moving pieces since you adopted rates in 2004. And I think so the Senator probably is the only one who remembers all the different challenges that were going in at that time. That's when you were coming out of the Happy Valley and all of the much lower than expected rates. And that's when the move away from the aggregate rate that's one of the reasons why that method was so subject to assumptions, that when all the assumptions were being changed by the legislature, the rates dropped dramatically, precipitously, unsustainably low, and then everybody was digging out of that hole from 2004 to 2008. So there's a lot to unpack from today, but we'll try to come up with some simple options and not too many options for you. And then what you end up doing, we'll talk about the pros and cons. You may come up with your own option in July, based on all the different pieces.
One more question. I mean, the fiscal year ends here in a couple weeks. Do we have a sense of where the investment returns are for this year right now?
For this year, right now, the last I heard was they're expected to be slightly higher than expectations, not anything dramatic, but I think
Yep.
slightly higher.
Yep, I'm nodding. Yep, it looks like it's just north of 7%, based on the end of May measurement.
Other questions? Oh, go ahead, Tor.
In response to Representative Burke's question, I could just add that the CIO of the WSIB will be presenting his quarterly performance report this Thursday in this room at 10 to 2 p.m.
Other questions? Senator?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, a ways back, I do remember that, and I want to compliment you on a sense of a little bit more of a long-term vision and sustainable budgeting. It seems like back in the day, we actually had the employers are screaming, yes, bring the rates down. Everything is the next quarter's earnings in front, whatever we can do to reduce our budgets. And you know, ironically, this one of those situations where what goes down must come up, and it sure did. And we had a bit of a problem recovering. I guess my question for you is, since you are looking at this long term and you want budget predictability so that you can actually project, you know, where you're going to be, where you're going to go, what you have to work with. Before the July meeting, if you could consider if there's any elasticity that you have at all in something like this that wouldn't change dramatically your budget. Say if we went from 853 to 87, or I mean, and come up with an answer about how narrow we can craft this and not rock anybody's boat, but do something here that is reasonable.
Is it?
That's it. Yeah, the only thing I had here is a summary slide, but it's everything we've already covered. Plan is healthy, funded status still over 100%. Got 1.27 billion in deferred gains, and then we talked about the impact of those deferred gains, expected impact on funded status and contribution rates. It's all dependent on if assumptions are realized. So, and we will be there next month. We will still be here to answer questions if you need us.
Oh, we appreciate it. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Mitch.
Thank you.
Nice work. Thanks for the details.
Thank
Very,
you.
very helpful. Mr. Nelson. Item number 3.
Okay. So one of the pieces of the omnibus bill was giving the board salary setting authority over some of the positions in the office. That omnibus bill was a little bit different from the bill that had been recommended by the board. And so we've got Karen here today to give you a introduction to this new responsibility that you have. What your responsibilities are under that new legislation and kind of where things sit, and what that looks like moving forward for you. We're going to treat this like a benefit improvement topic in the sense of having 2 or 3 presentations with a recommendation for your adoption at some point in time in the future. And this is Karen's presentation today is kind of the introduction. With that, you ready to roll? I'll turn it over to you, Karen.
Thank you. Chair Lawson, members of the board, Karen Durant, staff to the board. The issue, last year, the left board expressed interest in being able to set salaries in support of their fiduciary responsibilities. And so the board requested legislation to exempt staff from civil service, allowing the board the authority to set salaries in a separate bill. During session, the salary setting bill was amended and merged into the left 2 bill. The provisions of the bill became effective June 6th, 2024. As a reminder, prior to the legislation, 6 of the 8 agency positions were in Washington Management Service and considered civil service employees. The executive director and the executive assistant were already exempt. Those positions were not impacted by the proposed or final legislation. All employees in civil service have certain provisions afforded to them under rules, and salary structure management is under the jurisdiction of the Office of Financial Management. In order for the board to have authority over salary setting, positions needed to be exempted from civil service. Some amendment details. The original bill proposed exempting all positions in the agency. The amendment exempted the deputy director and the research and policy positions. The amendment also specified that the board would have authority to establish and fix salaries for those positions in consultation. We'll talk about that in a bit, with the director of the Office of Financial Management. The board also must consider comparable public sector positions using market-driven data, which we'll discuss later, when setting salaries. The notice of proposed changes to compensation levels shall be provided to the chairs of the fiscal committees of the House and the Senate. It's important to note that the language specifies proposed, so notice must be provided prior to changes in compensation becoming effective. Consultation. The board shall establish and fix salaries in consultation with the director of OFM. Initial contact was made with OFM to see if there could be a prior agreement on what consultation would mean in this process. The response indicated it was a common statutory term that was well understood, and there could be reasonable flexibility for how it is used. So I want to facilitate a discussion of consultation here, if that's helpful. For example, does consult mean the ability to veto the board's decision? That would be a potential principle. So I wanted to open it up for the board to discuss what, in your opinion, that would mean. The other option or something would be to ask the administrative committee to kind of hone in on that a little bit. And we can visit. So does anyone have anything to add?
What has been,
Hi, Karen. I have a question. This is Mark Johnston.
Hi.
Hi. So in terms of the consultation, you mentioned that it's a common statutory term. Could you give us some explanation of how it works in other agencies with respect to that same language, if there's a past practice, if you will?
That is an awesome question, and one that I asked OFM for some clarification on that, since that was their answer. I am still waiting to hear back on that.
Okay, because I'm sure the board has their own idea of what consultation means, and I would hope that we would be able to come to some sort of a reasonable agreement, given the purpose of the legislation from our end, and not to be, for example, not to allow the Office of Financial Management to veto what the board wants to do. That seems to me to be a total gutting of the statute. That's my perspective as a board member.
I understand. I appreciate that. That was a concept that we floated with them originally. And they said that, they were unwilling to kind of come to an agreement up front. So that's why I wanted to come to the board and ask if there were principles that we could agree upon. I, of course, will share whatever I learn from them when they get back to me on what they've experienced that to mean in other situations at the agency.
I think that
But besides the veto example that I brought up, does the board have any other ideas?
well, I mean, with our director, I believe it was notification. And so I don't know if notification and consultation are really, I mean, I know they're not the same words, but I mean, that's kind of our belief is that we did our homework, we had a presentation, that information was forwarded and sent to them.
Actually, the director's salary, and we have not implemented this yet, does say consultation as well.
So no notification.
And so we have been notifying OFM. What we've done since that bill has come into implementation is he's only received general wage increases. I believe right after the bill was implemented, the board acted immediately and then we notified, and there was kind of some discomfort with that. Since then, the board, I believe, I haven't been here for the whole thing, has only granted general wage increases. So we've not yet utilized that consultation provision for either process. So this would be helpful in Steve's process as well. Are there any thoughts, discussion, ideas?
Patrick, go ahead.
So I think you're going to go on to the next point in the presentation about market-driven data. So I think like agencies with like numbers of people doing the like work, it makes sense from my point of view as a board member for both the consultation piece and the market-driven data piece. I mean, I think we need to use as objective a measure as we possibly can to get the right salaries to the right people for doing the right thing. And so I'm really nervous about the idea that this legislation passed. I'll go back to something that we've been talking about for many years, which is the money comes out of the pension fund. It's not out of the general budget for the state. And so that is a key piece for me. It's essentially it's our money as a board, and that we ought to be able to find a reasonable, rational way to compensate the employees for the board. And so I'm very focused on doing whatever we can to bargain or convince the Office of Financial Management that consultation does not mean that they have the ability to veto what we want to do.
Understood. Okay.
Karen, let me understand, the bill that we put, that we proposed, SB 6198 and 2337, that was for the regular staff. Doesn't the board have the ability to set the executive director's salary?
That was previous.
Yes, that was a previous
Okay.
legislation. And so, as I've said, the only two positions that were not impacted by the board's bill was the executive director and the executive assistant. Those were already exempt.
And OFM believes that without sometimes not responding is a response. And when we asked about, you don't have, we said, well, we want to consult with you, but you don't have veto power and anyone's silent. Is that what I'm hearing? You haven't heard anything back from them?
I haven't heard back from them, other than when we reached out to try and define it originally, they were not interested in that.
I bet they
And
weren't.
kind of came back with exactly what I had presented to you, that it's well-defined legal term. And that's when I went back and said, that would be awesome if we could have some well-defined examples of what that would look like. So
this
we're
bill,
waiting to hear back on that.
so this bill went into effect June 6th of
It
this
did.
month,
Yes.
of this year. So, so I'm always the one that wants to push. So what is the, do we have any legal ramifications or legal grounds to work with OFM? Maybe on a gentle push?
Well, we have some other work to do
Okay,
too. We're not ready to
go after them.
move on, to move on any recommendation just yet.
Okay.
It needs to be data driven, so we'll just move
That's
on
where we're
to
going
the
next.
next. Yep,
Okay.
exactly.
Then I'll back
Perfect.
off a little bit.
Thanks for keying that up. Oh.
Go
Senator?
ahead, Senator.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I might know a little bit about these in the original versions. 6197 and 6198 are both mine. 6197 actually had this content as part of 6198 that stalled in the House. And so I talked to Senator Van de Weg and who's a co-sponsor on this, and we came to the conclusion that we have had the title bandwidth to graph 6197 into 1698, which actually was getting traction and moving at the time. It was my prime on both. It was my intent that we have a degree of autonomy with this, that we're not subordinate to OFM in these specific positions. The problem is that 6198, when it went to Ways and Means, there was a problem because they took over prime sponsorship there. It's their legislative intent as a committee that's going to determine, what they intended at the time or what the application of these terms are. So I'm kind of, I was supplanted, so to speak, in driving this bill and what I intend to do in the first place. Happens every once in a while. You have a bill that this sometimes is taken away from you by whatever entity happens here, and it does something completely different than what you expected. My original intent was specifically the degree of autonomy that you speak to. But right now, this is something we're going to have to determine. I'm not even sure that the whole Ways and Means Committee, and we'll have a conversation off the record, you and I later on. I'll tell you who the players and spectators are on this and what the agendas were. But I mean, there's that everybody on the Ways and Means Committee had some sort of a common knowledge or judicial notice as to specifically what this, what this was meant to apply to and not. So that's probably why you're not getting an answer.
Looks like, excuse me, Wolf, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick reflection back on some past experience. It could have said notify, it didn't. It does say consultation, but consultation in my past experience never meant veto. It meant consult. So it's a fairly, I won't say benign, but important step. And perhaps from OFM's perspective, could be the result of their housing human resources policy within OFM's jurisdiction and less about budget and control over funds. So again, this is about how you do things, how you compare, and perhaps a concern about precedent setting across other entities that might have boards involved in their governance as well, and the degree to which things need to be aligned in terms of statewide human resources policy. So I would just offer that as some additional context, guessing about what might be happening, and further guessing that there are relatively few windows of opportunity for OFM staff to take some vacation time over the course of the year. So part of the reason you may not have heard back yet is just people not being there to respond. So wouldn't read too much into it at this stage. Again, consultation is a relatively modest engagement with OFM and should not be seen as a fight.
Thank you.
Okay, market-driven data. The board must consider public sector positions using market-driven data. The language is specific about inclusion of public sector data, but is permissive regarding public sector data or other data points. A market analysis salary survey will need to be completed. Using a third-party vendor to complete the analysis will provide objective position matches for comparability as well as access to market database sources, ensuring economies of scale for the small scope of positions, as well as ensuring accuracy. Next steps. Any other feedback on consultation, if the board wants? And some kind of a motion for a contract with a third-party vendor to start our market-based analysis.
Entertain a motion. Move to move forward with a third-party vendor. Is there a second? Second.
Second.
Discussion on this. And Karen, just for background, I mean, obviously the reason for a third-party vendor, it's not being done in-house.
For objectivity,
Thank you.
just to make sure that we're nice and clean.
Yeah, and I think that helps with, it goes back to the consultation piece of it. If we have good data and we've got a third party review it, it makes the consultation much easier.
Absolutely.
And
On
just
the
saying, one of the other advantages of that third party vendor is they're going to have access to databases that we and government may not have access to directly. And in this instance, obtaining comparables for functions similar to what our staff provide this board might be an unusually large challenge. So reaching out to a third party that does a lot of these sorts of class and compensation studies is going to be beneficial in obtaining data and information quicker and perhaps more contemporary comparisons.
Thank you, Wolf, for that. Other comments or questions on the motion? Seeing or hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion's adopted. Thank you. Thanks, Karen. Mr. Nelson. Item number 4, looks like Jacob.
Yes, at the last meeting, when you adopted the interim work plan, one of the topics was standby pay. And so this is a topic that the board has heard a initial presentation on a couple of different times in the past, but it keeps coming up. And so kind of giving you the current lay of the land is today is Jacob. And with that, I will turn it over to you. You ready? Yeah.
Hey, good afternoon. For the record, Jacob White, staff to the board. So good intro by Steve there. Just a reminder that the issue in front of the board today is that standby pay is not considered basic salary for Left 2 members, while it is for PERS and PSERS members. I did want to add that when I gave the Left 2 board update to the Select Committee on Pension Policy, gave them a preview of some topics that I believe they may have some interest in because it could also impact other plans that are under the Select Committee. I did tell them about this one. While it is in PERS and PSERS, it's not in the teacher's plan, the school employees plan, or the state patrol plan. I think I did get a couple questions about it, but I do not believe it's on their agenda at this time to study this interim. So some background on the legislative history, in particular, when this ended up in PERS and PSERS. So in '94, it was added to PERS. At that time, there were 2 requirements. One was a vicinity requirement and there wasn't like the vicinity requirement. I can't remember the exact language, but it wasn't like a specific miles or anything like that. It was more general. And then also that that employees need to be prepared to report if needed. The next year, that vicinity requirement was dropped. I looked back at the legislative record. Obviously, this is back in '95, and it was part of a larger bill. And so there wasn't any testimony that I could find documented or detail about why exactly it was removed. And then in 2003, PSERS was created. And when it was created, it included standby pay as basic salary. Also, that was a huge bill, so did not all the legislative documentation didn't detail why or any discussion of standby pay. Just, my assumption would be that PSERS members were PERS members and then had the option to join PSERS. And then some of those positions were then PSERS moving forward. And so it probably just made logical sense that to not take standby pay away from those PERS members that were now eligible for PSERS. And then as Steve said, the board's looked at this a couple times, both in 2016 and 2018. Both times there was an initial presentation and then the board did not move forward with it. And so that means the board never received a pricing on it. So I don't have any materials to refer you to about what it cost at those times. So who earns standby pay? The short answer to this is firefighters, not law enforcement officers. At least at this time, I didn't do a survey of all law enforcement officers throughout the state, but just in speaking with some board members, they did not believe there were any law enforcement officers receiving standby pay. For firefighters, there were a few examples of that I took from the 2018 presentation of when standby pay is paid. Have those there in front of you. I don't think I need to read them all to you, but so I'll skip through that. And I did just ask the board members that I discussed the law enforcement officers with, and my understanding of that is that officers such as detectives and SWAT teams, special groups of law enforcement officers, special squad members, when they're considered more on call, and it's part of the job that when you're called in off hours that you're available, but you do not receive standby pay for that or any other special on call pay. So basic salary, reportable compensation, just to review that, I think everyone has an understanding of that, but basic salary, it's a two-step process for determining if payment equals basic salary, and basic salary is important because that goes into determining your final average salary, which is used in the calculation of your pension benefit. So that two-step process used by the law and DRS in determining if a payment is basic salary is first generally defined. Basic salary is generally defined as salaries and wages payable for services rendered. And then the second step of that is that there are certain payments that if they're not for services rendered, certain payments have been identified in law, in state law, that are for personal services rendered and may qualify if they're specifically identified in the law as basic salary. So that's what's happened here with standby pay and PERS and PSERS, is it's been specifically identified, and for the other plans, including Left 2, it's not specifically identified. And then there's been a determination by DRS historically that standby pay is not for services rendered, so it doesn't meet that first part of being basic salary, considered basic salary. So standby conditions. Oh,
yep. Hi, Jason. This is Mark Johnston. Do you have any examples at hand about what sort of services PERS and PSERS employees render that allows them to have standby pay? And is it basic salary for those people in those plans?
So for them, it's considered standby pay is considered basic salary because it's specifically identified in law. So it's not that they do something different when they're on standby than, and I didn't look into that. I just assume that it's very similar, that there's based off what the law says about standby pay and what I've learned about what firefighters and law enforcement officers or firefighters are required, which is on this slide right here, with what's required of them when they're on standby, that the requirements are, nearly identical. Yeah, that's only PERS and PSERS because the law, it's specifically identified in law as counting as basic salary.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Standby pay conditions, pretty much, yeah, what you would expect, that you're present at what's typically required. And this is outlined. So this for left members, there's no, since this isn't, standby pay is not in law. What equals standby pay is negotiated through collective bargaining agreements, and what the requirements of that, of receiving standby pay are. They are typically that you are present at a specific location or within a time frame when you are contacted and requested to be there. You must be prepared to report immediately if the need arises, and this means that you must not be impaired. And that you receive less than full pay, which I'll next slide go into some examples of that. So there are just some examples that have been gathered in the past by board staff are that what members typically receive for standby pay. Once again, it comes down to collective bargaining. It could be a percentage of regular pay. It could be a full-time overtime rate for a reduced number of hours, or a regular rate of pay for a reduced number of hours. It just varies by employer. So the next steps for the board today could take no further action again, or could motion for a comprehensive briefing. Typically in a comprehensive briefing, we do not provide pricing, but I think in this instance, looking at Steve, trying to get confirmation of this, but because this is a pretty simple policy decision of whether to include standby pay or not include standby pay, that we could work with the actuaries to get pricing if the board would like to move forward with this.
Yeah, historically, the next step, we'd be bringing you back options. But again, since this one is, the options are yes or no, then we might be able to then include pricing along with the option if you wanted to bring it back for a comprehensive briefing. The timing on that would be dependent on how long the pricing might take. So I can't give you a date like September. It might be as late as we try to have all the comprehensives done by November. So I could say it would be no later than November.
So if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
So looking for direction for our next steps. No further action or motion for a comprehensive briefing. Go ahead, Senator.
Point of inquiry. If a motion's made to move forward with a comprehensive briefing subject to existing agenda items that we've already established, should time become available, would that be an appropriate motion? You understand the call of issue that I'm trying to accomplish here. I'd love to put it in the queue, but not encumber anything else. We've run out of time, so it doesn't actually force us to deal with this. Should other issues take precedence for more time than expected?
For the staff, I don't think the timing, the resource issue will be significant. I think in this one, where the real resource issue is going to be is the actuary's office. And I'm trying to mentally calculate what other issues, like say COLA, we might also be asking for some pricing info on. So subject to that, then we could let you know before November if there just wasn't time to get the pricing that you want. And at November, and you could decide at that point in time to move forward or drop it.
Well, Mr. Chair, I move what he said.
Great.
That's a comprehensive no later than November.
Right. Comprehensive no later than November.
Yes.
again, we're going to give a lot of latitude to staff. I think we've already identified what our work is going to be for the interim, and this is just getting added to it. So, all right, on the motion, is there a second? Thank you. Discussion?
Quick question.
Sure, go ahead, Joe.
This was studied in 16 and 18. Is there some reports regarding that we can get to follow up on so that we have an idea of why it wasn't moved further forward in those two presentations?
Yeah, I can try to do more research on that. I didn't see anything in the record about it. Yeah, but I can ask around to see if people remember what was going on at that time and why it didn't move forward.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good point. I mean, seems to be a small bite that's just been sitting out there. It keeps coming back, it keeps coming back. Steve, am I right? So the WAC was put in place in '86. But prior to that, did we have collective bargaining agreements that were inconsistent along the way where certain agencies actually did include this and certain didn't? Was that the issue?
Yeah, it's something that we've run into in the past where, a lot of fire departments have it. Some had been reporting it as salary and shouldn't have, and got caught with DRS, had it backed out. In some, the standby fee is so intertwined with their regular salary that there might be people getting standby pay reported as salary today that just haven't been caught yet. So it is out there, but that inconsistency with PERS is where it tends to pop up. Somebody will hear from one of their PERS peers, oh, we get to include standby pay in our salary, and then they're like, well, why don't we? And that's part of the reason why it's kept popping up, if you will. But yeah, and back in '94, in terms of when it came up with PERS, even that I don't remember the exact case that brought that forward in legislation and why it was PERS only legislation at that time, because standby pay has been pretty among fire departments since '94 or earlier. So I don't know why it came up in PERS and not left sooner.
Go ahead, Gerald.
I'm curious, with agencies, there can be some creative wording on what they call this pay. And that's where I think that we're going to get into some headaches. If you are canine and you're on that night, you might have call out pay that you're sitting on, the potential of call out, but then it goes into overtime. And that's where I'm just wondering with the difference in law enforcement and fire. I understand what standby pay is. Some detectives, homicide detectives, can get, you're the only major crimes detective out tonight, so you're on standby, sleep with a beeper, and I don't think they have beepers anymore. But anyway, you might get called out. But I've heard it termed as call out pay, which then rolls into overtime. And I'm wondering if that's where the issue could come in.
Mr. Chair, not to belabor this, but they're two separate things. So the time you actually spend on call, there's a separate pay stream out there issue. If you get called out, there's a certain amount of time they have to pay a minimum on the call out. That is considered part of salary on this. So I mean, you're talking about maybe they're rolling them together?
Well, just as an example, if I was the only canine available, then I would have call out pay. And if I didn't get called out, I got 2.5 hours overtime for that shift.
And that's the piece I'm talking about where there may be, whether you call it call out pay or standby pay or whatever, there may still be jurisdictions out there now where it is being included in salary, obviously.
All right, on the motion. All those in favor of putting this forward with no later than November?
Comprehensive briefing no later than November.
Thank you. Yeah, those are your words. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
All right, thank you very much. Motion passes.
For the record, that was you, Mark, right, with the no?
Negative, yeah, it was negative.
That's correct. Yep.
Mr. Nelson. Thank you, Jacob.
Okay.
It's number 5 on the list.
As you all know, you are fiduciaries. You owe a fiduciary obligation to the plan.
Sorry. I was supposed to remind everyone, just so you're aware, that lunch is available.
Oh.
Sorry, just so.
You want to take?
Let's take 5 minutes or so. So we
Yeah.
can grab lunch and stuff, yeah. Not eat it in 5 minutes, but go grab and come back. Where do you at? 10 minutes? What do you want? 10 minutes? 5? I thought 5 was good too. 5, let's go 5.
How about 7? 7.
No, no.
Oh, now you're making.
Now, you said consultation? No.
Consultation, yours no.
Daryl, consultation? No.
How long do you think it should be?
Push on, green light
Yeah.
apply.
All right, we'll go ahead and bring everybody back together. Thank you for your 7.5 minute break. Nobody pays attention.
So this presentation is a little bit different than similar presentations that you've had in the past. There's been some changes in this area, and one of the changes is in our presenter today. So here to talk about open government training is the Open Government Ombudsman for the Attorney General's office, Morgan Damerow. And Morgan, I appreciate you being here today, and I'll just turn it over to you with that.
Welcome.
Great. Well, thank you for inviting me to come have a conversation about the Open Public Meetings Act. Where we're going to go during lunchtime here, and I decided not to get lunch because that just doesn't work well for kind of a lunchtime presentation. We're going to talk a little bit about the significance of open government, a little bit about the tiny bit about the history of the bill because it's kind of woven into some of the issues, and to some of the recent changes we've seen, and then spend the rest of the half hour really talking about the OPMA and what its current expectations are for how you all do business. One thing I do, two things actually I'm going to ask you to do. One is to keep in mind that my goal here is to give you some good information, hopefully, about what the OPMA is and what it requires. It's not to take place of legal counsel because we'll talk about some of the specifics where you need to talk to counsel about, what is, are we subject to the OPMA with what we're doing here or not? And so that's the first piece is hopefully give you a good foundation though, so it at least flags issues for you. So when you're looking at something, go, wait a second, Morgan said something about this, and double back with Tor on that. And then the second piece of it is, this is really best as a conversation. So feel free to interrupt me as we go along, ask questions. I'll do my best to provide information to you. Every once in a while I get a question doing that, where I say, nope, I might ask you to turn that one to Tor because you're looking for legal advice. So with that kind of as a disclaimer, we'll jump in with some of that history piece. So where we currently stand with the OPMA in its current structure is it came to us in 1971, which kind of makes some sense. It's also the same time period as FOIA passed a couple years before that in internet on the federal level. A year later, we got the Public Records Act here. If you look at what was happening, obviously we're right on the eve of the Watergate break-in when this is going on. There was a study out of the Pew Research Center looking at the trust in federal government coming out of the early 50s down into the mid 80s. And what we see is this basically a long precipitous slide. In the early 50s, people are trusting what government's doing. And it makes some sense with, if you look at where we're coming out of World War II, it's kind of a boom period. And then we get into the 60s and people really start wondering, okay, what's going on? And no longer are they willing to sit back and say, okay, yeah, they're exercising my best interests. We want to see what's going on here. And so what happened before 1971 was the OPMA said people get to see the final vote. People get to see the motion and the resolution of that motion. And what I think really, and what we see structured in the OPMA now is that's really interesting, but it's really not informative as to how you get there. It's the dialogue that matters. And so the big change we saw in 1971, still the case in the OPMA, is people get to see the discussion. They get to see everything happen, the dialogue that happens from the initial idea up to that final vote, or up until the decision not to do anything, things along those lines. So that's really the perspective you need to be thinking about it, because it frames a lot of what we see in terms of how meetings can happen, about communications and travels and things like that. And it goes to this idea that, so the picture on the screen is a Supreme Court justice in the late 1800s, early 1900s, writing a lot of letters about how do we encourage good decision making. And he's got this great quote that's worked into a lot of his letters about sunlight being the best disinfectant. Again, it goes back to the idea of how do we foster good decision making and good understanding of the decision making process. It's by it happening in this kind of a forum where people get to see what's going on, get to see the discussions versus, oh, this is a backroom deal for this kind of purpose. And that's really what the OPMA is designed to overcome. So a starting point, and the way to think about this, when we start thinking about the OPMA, and this is actually the exact same language you see in the public records, actually follow very much in the same kind of pathway here. With, the idea is that in sitting in office, elected, being appointed to council, or me working for the Attorney General's office, people don't people don't give up their authority. They delegate it to us to take action, to do things. And this is part of that tool in that checks and balance, where people get to see, okay, go forth and do this work, but we want to see how you get there. And while we've given you the decision-making authority, it's not ultimate decision-making authority. You're still accountable. And this is one of the tools that we get there through being able to watch the dialogue, watch the discussion, and see, oh, okay, now I understand how we got from this idea to a final vote. So when it gets to the OPMA, the intent is exactly, and this is why I started with 1971, is that it's those actions, it's the deliberations, people get to see them. And the first part, in the middle box, this idea of the people who insist on being informed, that is the 1971 version. Where we've seen the addition most recently is the second part of that, and informing the governing bodies of what we think as people, so to speak. And it's now no longer an opportunity just to come into the room, watch the discussion happens. There needs to be an opportunity for people to share information at regular meetings. And we'll talk about the specifics of that. That's the big step forward we've seen in the last couple of years when it comes to the OPMA, is this it's now a two-way street. One thing to keep in mind when you're talking about the OPMA and when you're thinking about, how am I going to fulfill my obligations here? The OPMA is written as a remedial statute. It's designed to accomplish something. It's designed to accomplish this transparency. So if you find yourself looking at, facing a court issue, looking at a decision that comes out of one of our courts, the OPMA isn't heavily litigated, but there are cases from time to time, and we saw one a couple of years ago now, primarily through recall actions. We've seen a couple others as well, but the courts are going to look at the expectations and say, okay, how do we interpret this in a means or in a way that's going to foster that transparency? And the reason I bring that up is so when you're thinking about one of your options and you're trying to figure out what you should do, you have one of those 50-50 calls, so to speak, when it comes to decision making. Think about it from, okay, what's going to make the light bend more towards transparency? And that should be your first starting point. Think about that. And if you're going to go a different direction, really give it some thought. And if it's truly a 50-50 tie goes to transparency, go towards the one that is going to be more transparent. You'll be better served. Because if you find yourself challenged in those actions, I almost guarantee that's what the court's going to do. They're going to look at this from that idea, liberal interpretation. What's going to make this the more transparent of issues? So the way to achieve that transparency. So that's enough of the policy. Let's get more into the nuts and bolts of the OPMA. Not surprising, the OPMA applies to multi-member public agencies, public bodies. What that means is there has to be a group of folks. By means of compare and contrast, I work for the Attorney General's office. Currently, the Attorney General is Mr. Ferguson. He's the head of the AGO. His actions, his meetings aren't subject to the OPMA, but your meetings as the left board obviously are subject to that. Another example is the Fish and Wildlife Commission, also subject to the OPMA because there's lots of people sitting and making that decision making. That's the key piece. It applies to deeper than that as well. It can go to subcommittees, commission, and other groups that you form, and we'll talk about that more. It applies to school districts. It applies to other special purpose districts. I'm not going to go too far into that since we're here talking about the left board. It's an easy reach that yes, you are subject to the OPMA just because of where you came from. By means of who it doesn't apply to, it doesn't apply to the courts. They're specifically exempted from the OPMA. The legislature is also specifically exempted from the OPMA. It doesn't apply to private organizations. I get lots of phone calls from people saying, my HOA isn't doing this and conforming with open meetings. And I have to have a really painful conversation with them about they don't have to. This applies to government entities. And I've already talked about the middle one, the example of Mr. Ferguson. It also doesn't apply to certain specific actions that you may take. If you're sitting in a licensing or permitting kind of capacity, I don't think that's relevant to the work you do. I could be wrong. So probably not going to apply. The biggest one is probably the matters that are governed by the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act. So if you're engaged in rulemaking, that's outside of the OPMA. A couple other examples would be collective bargaining is specifically excluded, more towards the clientele that you're working towards. I heard you talking about, the firefighters and the police, obviously. Their actions are in collective bargaining aren't subject to the OPMA. And then quasi-judicial. So if you're actually sitting in a judicial capacity hearing an appeal, and I don't know specifically if you would ever sit in that capacity. It comes up more with land use petitions and things like that with county. But if you do hear that kind of appeal process, it also would be excluded from the OPMA. So basic requirements is that all the meetings of a governing body of a public agency have to be opened. We'll talk about each piece of that. We'll talk about what meeting is. We'll talk about action. Governing body we've talked about is you, and LUF is definitely a public agency. One of the places we've seen growth in this, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, coming out of COVID, what we saw was that people's participation in public meetings went way up because we were streaming them. That's the only way we could do business. And so taking notice of that, our legislature made, one of the changes they made to the OPMA is this encouragement that governing bodies continue to use those kinds of technologies so people can participate remotely. Because what we saw during COVID was, like I said, the numbers went way up. And I think that's because there was lots of things we cared about. And I think it's also because we were all stuck at home and we were so desperate for content. We were willing to watch just about anything. And so we were watching school board meetings and we were watching city council meetings and things like that. But there's that expectation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So what is a governing body? Is the easy part of that is you all sitting here. You are the appointed folks to the left board. But I said it could go deeper than that. So if you create a committee or a subcommittee that's tasked with doing something on your behalf, if they're taking public testimony, public comment, if they're conducting a hearing that would be something that would be subject to the OPMA, then it's not just you that are subject to the OPMA, it's that committee or that subcommittee that you make. And so you need to think about that if you create a subcommittee to think about something, to do something on your behalf. And even if it's not a majority of you, it could still be subject to the OPMA. And that's really a specific issue. You have to look at, what are they doing? What are they tasked with doing? Because if it's purely advisory, if you create a subcommittee to go and review the other retirement boards for similarly situated agencies in different states and bring back a report on their investment strategy and just present that information to the board, purely inform the board as to what they're doing. they wouldn't be subject to the OPMA. But what you need to watch out for in those kinds of things is if there's a gatekeeper kind of function. It probably wouldn't happen with my example, but it could come up if, what we see commonly coming up is if there's a grant or if there's a committee is tasked with reviewing a series of applications for grants and then bringing back the top 5. All of a sudden we have a gatekeeper function. They get de facto decision making while you get the final say. If they get to limit the 5 that you consider to their 5 recommendations, then you have an issue. There's always, of course, a little bit something to talk about. If they bring the 5 recommendations to you, but then you could consider anything else, that's the time to have a conversation with Tora about, are we subject to the OPMA for that subcommittee's work or not? Just to make sure you're in a safe harbor that they are or are not. So what is a meeting is, again, kind of not to be circular, but a meeting is a meeting. A meeting is something like this, where there's a quorum of the board present and you're talking shop. You're doing something, some kind of agency business. The thing to watch out for with this, though, is that obviously it's easy to recognize a meeting that happens in this room. But meetings can occur virtually as well. They can occur via Zoom. They can occur via phone calls, via email. It's really about the discussion. Is there a discussion going on? That's what's going to determine whether there's a meeting, which is why you need to be very careful about these alternative means of communications. I was talking to somebody a little while ago, and they had shared that one of their board members had said, "Oh, let's have this. We should have this conversation offline." There is no such thing as an offline open public meeting. That's called a hidden meeting, and that's not good. So please don't do that. When it comes to meetings, also title doesn't matter. It really isn't whether you call it a regular meeting, you can call it a study session, a retreat. It's really about the content. It's really about what you're doing that determines whether it is a public meeting. Are you engaged in some kind of a conversation through some kind of a medium? And if you are, there has to be a quorum. So there has to be a majority of you present in that meeting. And there has to be a collective intent to have that meeting. I'll give you a couple of examples of that in a second. Then you have a meeting, and you need to make sure you've complied with the nuts and bolts pieces that we'll get to in a couple minutes here. One nice thing about the OPMA is the way it's structured is simply receiving information without comment is not a meeting. So you could actually get an email from somebody that just because you get an email from your colleague doesn't mean you have a meeting situation. My recommendation is please don't. If there's information you need to share amongst yourselves for the next meeting, share it with your board clerk and ask that it be included in the board packet. Because commonly what we see happen is, one board member shares some information and then another board member shares, oh, here's some information. And then another board member shares some information. And all of a sudden this thing has migrated from being a sharing of information to, oh, and here, let me give you a little bit of information. Here's my opinion. And, and does that, then when you start sharing information back and forth at some point, by default, you're going to kind of slide across that line. It's going to be a discussion. And so just be very cautious, please, if you're going to share information amongst yourselves, that you never, well, the first thing is no good comes from the respond all button. It shouldn't exist, but please don't use it. But best practice is if you do need to share something for, say your next meeting, share it with your clerk and ask your clerk to include it as part of the board packet or something like that. That's a safer way to do it versus starting that communications pathways. As I said, there does need to be a collective intent for there to be a conversation. Give you 2 examples of one good and one bad to where that happened. The example of where there was not a collective intent came up from this San Juan Island case. And what happened was it was a planning commission, and they were dealing with an issue. There's 7 members on this board, and 2 of them were having a conversation about it. It was still under the quorum threshold, which would be, if there's 4 people on this conversation, we have a problem. The 2 of them that were having this conversation about this issue, that's okay. 2 people can talk to each other. Two of you could talk to each other without stepping across that threshold for having a quorum. What happened in this case was then the 2 members involved a 3rd member. And what they didn't realize in that was the 3rd member had already had a conversation with the 4th member about this. And so the board, in this case, the court said there was no collective intent to have a meeting because of the way it developed. It is possible to have this kind of a serial meeting or a wheel hub meeting where one person becomes the conduit for things, or where it kind of continues on, kind of a continuum. What happened in San Juan Island, which I think was, like I said, my theory as to why the court found there wasn't a collective intent, was what they did next. The second they realized they had crossed this quorum threshold, they stopped. And it was like, oh, step away, mic drop, and they didn't do anything further. As compared to what we know from the court decision in the City of Seattle case. You probably recall a few years ago now, the City of Seattle passed a head tax. Passed on a Friday afternoon, and there was a fair amount of public uproar. A lot of the companies were very upset with what the City of Seattle's decision-making process had been, what they'd come up with. And then if you recall, on Monday morning, there was a second vote and it vaporized. And it got everybody's head spinning. It's like, okay, what happened? How did we go from full forward on Friday to almost a full stop on a Monday morning? So there were a lot of public records requests. And what I know about this case is what I read in the decision. So with that kind of a disclaimer, what the court found was that over the weekend, there'd been this series of conversations between council members and council member staff. Trying to figure out what are we going to do? How are you going to vote on, if this comes back up on Monday, how are you going to vote? And the court said there's a collective intent here to have this conversation. They're trying to figure out what they're going to do. And not that the conversation was wrong, but the forum was inappropriate. That forum should have been the open forum. People should be able to see what was going on instead of these conversations going on kind of in email and telephone calls over the weekend. And so that's the difference between them. And the court said, based upon what they saw was an intent to find out from their colleagues how they felt on this issue now, that the court said was, and we see an intent to have this conversation. That's really what it comes down to. Was there intent to continue on? And so there's the dividing line between them. So we know what a government body is. We know what a meeting is. We know how you end up in a meeting inadvertently. So please watch your communication. So then the question is: so what is action? What is it that looking for that the final piece of this? Action is everything. Not to scare you, but action is the former person who used to wear the ombuds hat, Nancy Creer used to describe it as being the sausage being made. And people get to see that whole process. They get to see everything that goes into making the sausage, which is the public testimony, the deliberations amongst you all, the considerations, the discussion, any evaluation. It also includes final action as a subset of action, but it's the entire process. One thing to keep in mind is that the OPMA is triggered whether or not there is final action. It's the discussion. And I guess the comment I made when I was starting off, that's really where people get to see, how did we get here? What's really interesting about this issue? Why did the chair vote the way the chair did? Oh, I understand. This is the chair's point of view, and this is what Senator Hawley shared, and all those kinds of things. And so so keep in mind with your open public meeting, it's that action. It's all of it. And of course, it's final action. And final action is what you'd anticipate. I arrived shortly after 11 and saw a final vote on one thing. That is final action. It's also a little broader than that. It may be a final vote. It also could be just general consensus making as well. And what you need to watch out for, particularly with final action, is, and we'll talk about executive session in a couple of minutes here. If you find yourself reaching a consensus, you're making a final action, you're making a final decision without necessarily a final vote. All those final decisions, though, have to be done in an open forum. Even if you can go into executive session, and I'll cover a few of the topics for that, you still have to come back into the open session to make that final decision. Secret ballots aren't allowed. That's part of what happened with City of Seattle, and that was part of the issue. They found that what was happening with the discussions over the weekend, it was polling going on, and people was like, oh, how are you going to vote? I talked with an agency a while ago that I think with good intent. Had an issue they were trying to deal with. And so the chair said to the folks, give it some thought, send me an email on your vote. And then they were going to publish that email later. And then the chair had some second thoughts. It was like, should I really be doing this? And so called me to get some information. And so I shared these kinds of things with him. And I really, really encourage you not to do that, because that could be interpreted as polling or as a secret vote. People get to see it, even though after the fact there was an intent to publish. I really encourage folks to make that final decision in this context. The other thing we've seen from the changes moving forward in the OPMA is the public attendance. And the first part of that is unchanged. The first part of it is, and this has been actually pre-1971 as well, you cannot put conditions on people's ability to attend these meetings. What that means is it's an open door. I noticed a sign-up sheet in the back. You can ask people to sign up, but you can't require them to sign up generally. And the reason I say generally is because you can adopt generally applicable rules and conditions to determine, to protect public health, to protect against interruptions, things like protect against safety. This is a very new provision. We have seen no litigation on it so far. What it means though is those reasonable rules you can set. I encourage folks to look at it from what's the least restrictive thing we can do, or articulate, if you have thinking about when we were coming out of COVID, for health reasons, we were still tracking. So we were asking people to let us know you were here for this purpose, but it's not for, it's so that we can get in touch with you in case we have an exposure event or something like that. Again, you can set reasonable rules, but I encourage folks to pick the one that's least intrusive. Go back to the idea of you're going to liberally construe the OPMA for its purpose, which means that the court's going to look at any restriction you put in place is there something, is this really necessary? Is there something else that could have been done? So I encourage folks to look at that from that point of view. There is an encouragement to continue to use remote access tools. I'll come back to that in just a second. And then one thing that does matter, and unfortunately we've seen a couple of cases with this is a public meeting, which means if somebody in the audience wants to record it, they can do that. And it happens countless times. It's even easier now that everybody has smartphones. If somebody wants to start recording this, that's the definition of public meeting. While Washington is a two-party consent state, meaning for private conversations, you have to get both parties' consent. This is not, this by definition, not that. This is a public meeting. So as long as folks aren't being disruptive, obviously if somebody in the audience chose to rush the dais and was putting a phone in the chair's face going, say that again, that's not okay. You can set reasonable rules of conduct and things like that. That's a disruption. City of Mesa in Eastern Washington, they had this come up and they unfortunately called the sheriff and ended up having an individual arrested who was just trying to record a meeting. I'll cut to the short summary. It didn't go well for the city or for the sheriff. So this is a public meeting. People get to record it as long as they're not being disruptive. There is an encouragement now that we continue to use the tools we were using during COVID, because like I said, public participation has gone way up in meetings. The encouragement is to use tools that don't require additional costs. Nice thing about most Zoom, Teams, a lot of those platforms, you can send out a public link. You're encouraged to stream it if you can, but at least make the audio, so a phone number so folks can dial in. Most agencies I've talked with are continuing to provide Zoom links so that people can watch from home, things like that. We see some changes for that with school boards, which I won't, unless somebody is sitting on a school board and has a specific question, I probably won't talk about that in a lot of detail. But I think that's a foreshadowing of some of the things we're likely to see in the future with public attendance or public participation. There's going to be a further step towards mandating this. And when the legislature was considering this most recent bill, it started off as a mandate to continue to use these tools. And I haven't been able to confirm this from anybody. So my personal theory is that they recognize that for like the left board, you have some technology resources, but there's jurisdictions in Eastern Washington, some mosquito districts that work out of garages and things like that. They use other people's facilities for meetings, and they just didn't have the bandwidth to make these tools mandatory. So I think I suspect what we'll see in the future is, same as there are some exceptions for some small agencies now, we'll see some mandates for streaming coming up at some point in the future. Then with possibly some exceptions for small agencies, probably wouldn't apply to you just because they seem to, the most recent exemptions talk about in terms of capital and economics, and the left board, I suspect wouldn't meet those, but we'll see what the legislature finally does. The biggest change that I think really isn't a change when it comes to the OPMA is this idea of public comment. This is something that most agencies have been doing for years, but it's now required to take public comment at any regular meeting at which final action is taken. So we'll talk about the types of meetings there are in just a second, but you have two choices when it comes to now this required public comment. One is you're required to take public comment orally. So if you'd have a microphone available, and I saw public comment on this afternoon's agenda for the 7th item. And so if people want to make public comment, I'm assuming the chair would open the mic and say, okay, we're now accepting public comment. You can put reasonable rules in place for that. One of those is a sign up. You can, in order to properly manage the meeting, you can ask people to sign up. I've seen some agencies be pretty creative with that. Some are, if somebody gives me a fake name, they don't really care. It's more about how do I know who they're going to be able to call the next person. Other agencies have simply given out numbers and just called up number 1, number 2, number 3. And part of that also means, though, it's still your meeting. It's still your ability, you get to control what happens, and you can set for years we've been setting timelines. Public comment, you have 3 minutes. Share what you think, share what you want to say. That's it's not specifically called out, but that seems to fit within the reasonable rules that we can put in place for the orderly conduct of a meeting. The second way you can, before I move off oral comment, you do have an expectation when it comes to oral comment. If you have somebody who is unable to make the meeting because they have a disability, limited mobility, or any other reason that makes physical attendance difficult, so a pretty broad standard, you do have an expectation, if you can accomplish it with reasonable means, to allow public comment from those folks. And I've seen some folks do this with Zoom. It's a little bit easier. With Teams, it's easier. You can have the clerk share a link. It says oral comment. It doesn't mean you have to turn the cameras on. And unfortunately, we've seen some really horrific things happening recently with the video portions. And so when you're thinking about remote public comment, talk with Tor about your options there, but specifically says oral, which means it's audio. People get to share. And part of it is because I can hit the mute button pretty quickly. And you can typically tell when people are ramping up versus, I can put an image on the screen really fast, and that's something you can't unsee. And we've seen there's been reports of this happening across the state recently. So do keep that in mind with your oral comment. The other way you can take public comment is by written public comment, and you have the choice. You can do either or, you can do both. It's kind of the way the board decides to do business. Again, you can set reasonable rules when it comes to written comment. One of those reasonable rules, I think, is for a written comment has to be submitted by 5 o'clock the day before the meeting, because it needs to be distributed to the board, because presumably the reason that's being submitted, it has to be distributed to the board, is to give you the opportunity to read it. So you can be informed as to what the public thinks on whatever issue you're dealing with. That doesn't mean that you have to accept something that's this. I'm going to go jump in the Wayback Machine. It doesn't mean you have to accept something that's the size of the Seattle Times Yellow Pages. It means you can put reasonable rules. You could say up to 3 pages, up to so many characters, so many words, something that's manageable along those lines as well. But you have the choice between these two. And one thing I do recommend is if you do receive written comment, if that's the way you choose to do it, that the chair, as part of opening the meeting, as part of that opening kind of soliloquy, says, and we accepted public comment. We received 15 public comments. Those were distributed to the board as of 8 o'clock this morning. Get it on the record. So one, the public is aware of what happens because obviously they submitted it for a reason. And secondly, so that's in your record. So it's in the minutes, and so that when the auditor comes in and looks at your processes when it comes to the OPMA, they can say, oh, they're meeting their obligations. And then the third reason, and hopefully this doesn't happen, is so that if you ever get challenged, if you ever find yourself and Tor ends up representing you in the Thurston County Court, he can say, Your Honor, this is our practice. As you can see, it happened. There's nothing to see here. We complied with our obligations when it comes to the public comment. One thing I have seen most agencies do is public comment is typically high on the agenda. Because the idea is to inform the governing body as to what it is that they're, how they feel on an issue. And public comment afterwards really doesn't seem to accomplish that. Other thing I've seen happen, and I think is more the practice with this board, is that if there's public comment on a specific issue prior to the general open public comment, you're integrating that into that part of the conversation. Again, if that's how it happened, that's, I would make sure that's reflected in the minutes. We took public comment on what the issue was. Probably a wise idea to have that included in the minutes so that people are aware. Also in the announcement in the board's agenda, things along those lines, just so people know what to expect and they know when to be participating in the meeting. I mentioned this a moment ago, and I'm not going to go to it in a lot of depth, but unfortunately, we are seeing more and more issues with people and interruptions and disruptions. And I suspect if we could ask the CEOs from Zoom if they could change one phrase in the world, they would change the word Zoom bombing, because that really became a thing when, obviously we were pushed into this realm during COVID. But like I said, we're still seeing that. But when it comes to the OPMA, the OPMA has a structure built into it, and basically it's what you would expect. This is still your meeting, even though the public is here. There's now an expectation to listen to what they have to say. It's still your ability to control your meeting, and the way it's structured in the OPMA is that if I was being disruptive, the first approach would be to engage with me. And say, Morgan, would you please, your 3 minutes is exhausted. Would you please take your seat? And then you can choose to turn off my mic. And then I guarantee you, just the way I can speak, if you turned off my mic, I could still fill this room. And then it progresses on from there. Then you ask me to leave, and then maybe you take a recess, 15 minutes, get calmer heads to prevail, and then you can clear the room and invite people back in. You can invite people that aren't being disruptive back in. If that doesn't work, then you can adjourn this meeting to a different location, in which case you have to take if there's a member of the media present, you have to take the media with you. Unless the media is the one that's being disruptive. I've been practicing law for 25 some odd years. I've never seen the media do that, but there's always a possibility, and so whatnot. My recommendation is that if you don't have it, that work with Tor on developing, on the very back page of the board packet, a break glass in case of emergency kind of sheet that says, here's what to do in the event that we have an issue. Because this is partially where the city of Mesa got into difficulties. They found themselves with somebody they perceived as being disruptive, and they didn't know what to do. And this is one of those places where getting caught flat-footed just contributes to the possibility for some unfortunate decision making. So I recommend having that kind of thought out ahead of time and hope that you never have to use it. So there's kind of the nuts and bolts as to where we are at this moment. Okay, let's talk about what the kind of meetings they are. There are 2/3 kinds of meetings. Regular meetings are the ones that happen because this is what your schedule says. You've adopted it. You're meeting the first Monday of every in the quarter, or whatever that process is. They happen because that's what the schedule is. You do have some very specific nuts and bolts you have to meet for that. You have to have an agenda posted online 24 hours in advance. The agenda is basically what are you going to be doing? And this is pretty standard when I look at agendas, the one you had for today. A description of what are the issues you're going to be considering so that the public can know, is this something I care about? Is this something that I'm going to attend this meeting because they're dealing with an issue I'm passionate about? Or is like, yeah, nothing to see here. I've got other things to do today. Thing with regular meeting is you can modify this agenda. When you sat down this morning and if one of you decided that there was a new issue you wanted to talk about, you're not stuck with this agenda. You could add something to it. Typically, it's done by a motion. I've seen a motion of a committee member, a board member that says, I make a motion to add agenda item 8. And agenda item 8 is this topic I'd like to talk about. Any seconds, you vote. If it's added, it's added. If it's not, it's not. That's okay. With regular meetings, if you add an agenda item like that, you can actually take final action on that item. And sometimes there's good reason to do that because it's an issue that is pressing, it needs to be resolved. Working with my boards, I always encourage, if they're going to add an item, do it sparingly. I always question, is there something you have to do today, or can we schedule at least a special meeting? And the reason is because, it goes back to the idea of what bends towards transparency. What is going to make people know what's going on? And particularly when agenda looks totally different at the end of the day. If you say we're going to deal with these 7 things, and then you deal with the 14 things, and the 7 things that are added are all the highly controversial issues, people start to wonder, wait a second, what's going on here? You can do it. It's perfectly legal, but I always just encourage restraint if you're looking at that. If you miss the posting requirement, it doesn't mean that anything you did at that meeting is in error. Let's say that for some reason it didn't post to the website and the link, it was a dead link. You tried, it just for some reason technology did what technology does. It doesn't mean that everything you did at that meeting was invalid. It means that there was a glitch. It means as long as you met every other requirement, if you had the agenda developed, you did you called the meeting properly, the votes happened properly, then the OPMA says that just failing to post is not going to invalidate all your decisions. There's an exception for very small agencies now when it comes to regular meetings and posting requirements. If anybody has any questions about it, I'm happy to talk about it. But they're really focused towards very small jurisdictions with very limited areas. And the left board doesn't qualify from what I know. So unless there's any specific questions, or if one of you sits on a small board and would like to talk about it, I'm going to move past that. The other kind of meeting is a special meeting, and these are basically any other meeting you have. This is a meeting that happens because there's something you need to deal with. And these can be called through two different ways. One, it can be called by the chair, and the chair can send out notice, or it could be called by a majority of the board members. This is the one place the OPMA says you can have an offline conversation, and basically to have a conversation about having a conversation. Be super careful if you're doing that you don't then talk about the issue. It's really hey, we need to get together to talk about X. And schedule that meeting. You do have some nuts and bolts pieces that you have to comply with. One is that you have to give notice, and has to be written notice to all the other board members. That doesn't mean you have to send a letter out via snail mail. It can be an email, things like that. You do need to post that meeting. One or two places. You have to post it at the agency's regular business address. You should put it on the agency's website. It also has to be posted wherever that meeting is going to happen. From time to time, there have been special meetings that have, instead of happening at City Hall, I know one that happened where they rescheduled a meeting as a special meeting to happen in an airplane hangar because they were expecting hundreds of people to turn out, and city council chambers would hold like 25. And so that was a special meeting, but you have to post it both of those places. You have to give notice to the media if you have a standing request from them. We don't see that very much anymore because most media is relying on websites and things like that to get notice of meetings, but it is something to watch out for. This is one of the places where we've seen litigation recently, and this goes to both. I think the notice required for the business to be transacted has to be in that notice, the time, the place as well. Think about it, are you giving people sufficient notice as to why you're going to be meeting? And the same thing I think is parallel when it comes to the agenda for your regular meetings. People need to be able to understand what it is you're going to be dealing with. Our Supreme Court looked at a notice of a regular meeting, a special meeting, the business to be transacted, and it said local control was the extent of what it said. And our Supreme Court looked at that issue and said, can I tell why the board is getting together, what they're going to be talking about? And they couldn't. They, of course, said that's not sufficient notice. So be more specific than that. If you're meeting to talk about, investment strategy in light of interest rate decline, maybe that's what the agenda item says, something like that. People need to be able to understand what it is why it is you're getting together, what it is you're going to be talking about. There's a third kind of meeting, or this is really a special meeting. It just kind of fits with two different buckets. You can get together to have an emergency without notice. If giving notice would cause, if it's impractical, basically, if it would cause, substantial loss of property, it would cause death, something like that. Somebody would be significantly injured, which is, and I said, I've been practicing advising boards for 25 odd years. I've never done one of these. It's what happened when Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980. It is when, the town of Lind was facing wildfires, or Mapton, that burned a couple of years ago in a day. That's the kind of thing we're talking about with these special meetings, the kind of emergency. Our Supreme Court has looked at this and said economic loss doesn't qualify. It would be unfortunate. In that case, what they were looking at was, was a school. The school, there was a strike, and could they force something to happen? Whether the board wanted to get together to talk about the strike, and did they want to take legal action? And if they waited 24 hours, then the strike would have been on for a day, which means that economic issues to the school district. And the court said, that you haven't convinced us that's enough. That's economic. That's unfortunate, but that's not the status of emergencies that we're talking about here. So if you think you have one of these, definitely talk with Tor. And I'm hard pressed to come up with one, but every once in a while somebody shares one with me. I'm like, yeah, I could see that. But it's going to be a very high standard. The legislature has kind of used the two terms, the same term in two different ways. We can have an emergency meeting, which is the ones I was just talking about, because there's going to be some kind of a natural disaster, or we can have a remote emergency meeting. And this is a meeting that is because of a declared emergency at the state, at the federal level. There's been an emergency declared, and then the agency, and it doesn't say who in the agency gets to make this decision. But typically what I've seen, it's the chair working with legal counsel, working with maybe the executive group for the board, makes a determination that we can't have a meeting either with anybody present. So think about the town of Mapton when it was facing wildfires. They were not going to City Hall at that point for obvious reasons. So if they were going to have a meeting, that could happen completely remotely. The other option is, the town of Lynn was facing wildfires, but they weren't quite to the same place that the Mapton was. They could hold a meeting, a hybrid meeting, basically, that said, okay, we're going to have some of the members here present. Other members are going to be participating remotely, but the public can't get here, so they're going to be totally remote. In those kinds of emergency situations, you can go back to basically where we were in 2021, 2022, and have a remote meeting. You do have to give specific notice of, how, for this meeting that's happening remotely, how can people participate? Is it going to be just by phone? Are we going to send a hyperlink because we're using Team or Zooms or something like that? How is the public participation going to be fostered? If you don't give that to folks, then you can't have the meeting. People have to still be able to watch the sausage being made, listen to the sausage being made. This is slightly different, however, than this meeting today. I'm not sure if I'm assuming this is a regular meeting. You have folks participating remotely. That's okay. That's pursuant to your own rules, because this is a regular meeting. Your process allows them to participate from wherever they may be. I've done meetings along these lines where nobody was present. It's still a meeting. It's still not because of a declared emergency. If it's a regular meeting, a special meeting, everybody participating remotely, you still have to have a room. You still have to have some place where the members of the public could come in, watch the screen. If they want to make public comment, presumably make public comment, something along those lines. You still have to have a physical location if it's not one of these declared emergencies. So hopefully I've separated that out sufficiently for you. I'm going to go a different direction now for a second. Obviously, the OPMA is all about public participation, observation of meetings. That doesn't mean that everything you do has to happen in this kind of a venue. You do have the opportunity to go into closed session, but it's for very limited, specific reasons. And I suspect Tor does this. I know I did this with all of my boards and commissions. I always go back and look at 4230-110. And there are about 25, I can never remember that number for some reason. Various reasons you can go into executive session. The first one is national security. Never got to do that one. More commonly, it's because they're going into executive session to get legal advice. That's an acceptable reason. You can go in if for various reasons that are specified in the OPMA. You do have some very specific procedures you need to follow. One, put that in your agenda and cite the statute. I would not get creative with this. I always advise my clerks to quote the statute. If we're going in for the purpose of purchasing real estate and having this conversation in public is going to cost the agency more, cite that statute, cite that provision in 110. Put it in the agenda. The presiding officer, the chair in this case, has to make that announcement going in. We are going in for this purpose. Again, go back to that language. You have to tell folks how long are you going to be in executive session, and that's completely up to you. Sometimes I've seen boards, they pick 10 minutes because they think they can get done in 10 minutes. Other times it's 45 minutes or an hour. Thing about that is once you pick a number, that's your number. You cannot come back into open session before that. That is your time period. And it makes some sense because people might wander off and they may care about the issue that's coming right afterwards. And so they need to know when to come back. The purpose for the executive session has to also be in your minutes. That is a new requirement as of a couple of years ago. And most agencies were doing that already, but it does need to be in there. the thing to keep in mind, so I'm going back to that idea. So you say you're going to go in for 30 minutes and you're engaging in those conversations. Then, you're not done. You decide you need more time. Then the presiding officer has to come back out into open session and make the announcement that the board has decided that we need an additional 15 minutes, whatever number it is that you decide. And the OPMA says it has to be the presiding officer. And you have to make that announcement. And I've seen this announcement happen to empty rooms, just basically talking to chairs. Do it anyways, and then put it on to make sure that's reflected in the minutes, is that the chair came back out, made the announcement, and go back into executive session. And you're not limited to the number of times you can do that. And I've seen boards do this 2, 3, 4, 5 times because it's been a heated conversation. But in going into executive session, you can have these permitted discussions in executive session. You cannot take final action. You cannot make a decision, which is where, going back to the definition of final action I was talking about, when you find yourself saying the words, "So are we in agreement?" You've probably gone too far. So you have to kind of police yourselves as to having that conversation. Have a robust conversation, but when you find yourself moving towards the decision point, it's time to stop. And it's time to say, okay, now we need to go back into session. And I've seen some chairs handle this very effectively, saying, I think we've exhausted our conversation and our deliberations on this issue. Let's go back into executive session and entertain a motion. Something like that to signify that we're going too far. And I've seen, play out in various ways that way. But you do need to come back into out of executive session into open session for that final decision making. A couple examples I just chose. There's countless ones in there. If you're hiring a new executive director, you can evaluate those applications. You can conduct interviews in executive session. That's where you need to be careful. Not, oh, I think we should hire Morgan instead of hiring Tor because Morgan has all this experience and Tor is good, but no, sorry, Tor. But you need to be careful of those kinds of conversations. I've talked about real estate, legal counsel, national security. There are countless ones in there, but you need to find one of those. You can't just because, ooh, this is sensitive. There is no such thing as a sensitive exemption for going into executive session. You can travel together. You can go to conferences together. My advice is try to stay under the quorum line if you can, but sometimes that's not possible. The key thing you need to pay attention to is don't talk shop. Don't talk about issues that the board is going to consider, because the second you start talking shop, you've ventured into a prohibited territory, and you're now conducting a meeting if there's a quorum of you present. Talk about everything else. Talk about the weather last weekend and how we had, I think, everything possible. Talk about Father's Day. Talk about fishing. Talk about hiking. Talk, all those kinds of things. Don't talk shop when you're going to conferences or if you're traveling together to get to a meeting or something like that. But you can travel together without it necessarily violating the OPMA. But this is where everybody has to police themselves. Because you can find yourself inadvertently just, it's a long drive from here to Spokane. And so you get outside of Moses Lake and you've exhausted all the other topics. And all of a sudden it's like, now let's talk about, just don't do that kind of a thing. You do need to keep minutes. There is only one specific thing that has to be in your minutes, and that's the reason you're going into executive session. After that, it's by board practice. I've read some minutes that are incredibly cryptic and you can barely tell anybody was in the room. I've read others that read like minutes, and I always feel bad for the clerk of the board having to keep track of all that. I'm more an advocate for issues minutes. We had this conversation, here's the key points, here's how the vote turned out, something along those lines. They do need to be approved as promptly. Typically what that means is that your next, the minutes from this meeting would be approved at your next meeting in kind of that rolling basis. There have been recall petitions based upon board members refusing to approve minutes. It doesn't happen very often. It's really, but it's a chance for people to get to see what happened in the minutes and things like that. You do need to keep them. The scary part of the OPMA, and there's a couple of reasons why it matters. One is because as board members, if you knowingly violate the OPMA, you are individually responsible. For the first knowing violation, it's a $500 penalty if the court chooses to find that. Each subsequent knowing violation, it's $1,000 personal penalty. On top of that, your agency is going to end up paying attorney's fees. And it makes some sense. The idea is to encourage transparency, encourage enforcement. The OPMA really deputizes the community to make sure the agencies are doing this properly. And as a means of getting that to happen, people are very unlikely to bring OPMA lawsuits if they're going to have to pay the entire legal fee. But what it says is if they're successful, then the agency is going to pay. I'm going to switch legal structures for a second, but to give you an idea of the way it plays out, there was a county in Washington that had a PRA violation. The PRA penalties were $15,000 and the attorney's fees were $45,000. And it's not uncommon for attorneys now to be $300-400 an hour. So you're talking about some pretty good economics. Thing that concerns me more about it is that the court could decide that whatever action you took didn't happen. They could say, yeah, you thought you made that decision, but now, nope, you violated the OPMA sufficiently that that decision is invalid. You could, if you have an early violation of the OPMA, it doesn't mean that everything downstream is now contaminated. It means you had an early violation. Your final decision may still be insulated enough, but it concerns me, which is why I've seen some agencies, when they've been concerned about early procedure matters, call the third grade resolution and call a do-over. And if you're concerned that you may have made a technical violation early on or a substantial violation, do it again. You can't necessarily cure the violation, but you can insulate the decision downstream by having all those conversations again. Because that's what scares me about the OPMA. Think about the decisions you make in terms of long-term strategies. And then if a court was to come in and say, yeah, that decision you made doesn't exist, where does that leave you? Where does that decision and everything that's happened since, is it going to be valid? And so that's actually the piece that scares me more about the OPMA. I don't want to see anybody obviously having to write checks, but I hate to see courts overturn decisions and then leave agencies in kind of a legal limbo. And then the other kind of action that can be brought is if somebody in the community thought that the board was going to, they had enough information to say, they're all getting together, they're going to have a meeting. They haven't given proper notice because I know they're having a barbecue at somebody's house, and they've specifically said we need to talk about where we're going with this issue. Or somebody could file an action and file an injunction basically that says, Your Honor, tell the board not to do this, not to have this meeting. That could also happen. Basically, it's a warning from the judge saying, I need you to comply with the OPMA going forward. It's the middle one that concerns me the most of all these in terms of having agency action overturned. So with that is a refresher and the updates that the legislature has made to the OPMA in the last couple of sessions. Can I answer any questions for anybody?
Questions, Patrick?
Yeah, I got a couple things and I'll do them in hypotheticals. So
Thank you.
So
somebody.
yeah, I know somebody that knew somebody. So
Not in this room.
yeah,
Please.
you have a board. There's an opening on the board. You go through the OPMA on what you can and can't do. You have 7 or 8 applicants. They come, they take their 3 minutes in the open meeting to discuss. Then we'd go into they'd go into an executive session to discuss the applicants. That is still, is that?
I need to double check the language. I'm crossing, there's a piece that's sticking in my head that doesn't want to make me say yes to that. You can evaluate the applicants for public employment, but there's a specific provision, a couple places about that set elected office different. So I wanted to, because you're talking about, we said board, I'm assuming like a member of this board.
An appointed position, not this board, but like a commissioner issue or a city council board or something like that, where there's an opening and it's an appointed position by the body. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. And I just want to double check that language before I say conclusively that you can go in to evaluate those. I think you can, but I'd be happy to follow up with you.
It might come down to your second point, though.
So
there's a discussion. Let's just say it's allowed. Then there's a discussion, and you have you got 8 people in a room, or you got 6 people in a room, and you're looking to appoint the 7th. So it takes a supermajority to get that in an open meeting to elect that person. But you got 8 applicants, And so you're in the back room, you're discussing who's good, who's bad, who's gonna be there. Because you gotta cut it down to one person, because if you don't make the appointment, then the county will make the appointment for you.
Mhm.
Okay, so all of a sudden you got 6 applicants. And you gotta have a discussion on who's good, and who's bad.
And you
And
can,
you gotta get down to at least one candidate that needs to be voted on once you come out of executive session.
in your executive session, you have a conversation of each individual. You say, okay, what makes Morgan the most qualified for the fire board, for the board of the fire district? And then what makes Tor the best candidate? And what makes, whoever the applicants may be, analyze them. The second you start comparing us, then you're creating a problem. You're actually evaluating the qualifications. You're starting to reach consensus making.
So you do that. So that's what I'm getting to. So now you got 6 applicants and you discuss them all, but you got to come out of executive session with somebody that's going to take that position. How do you get into a discussion when you're supposed, especially politically, to make yourself available to discuss who's going to be the best person on that board? And then once you have, all of a sudden you're looking around the room, nobody has said anything, but all of a sudden everybody has one name in mind. But you can't say, okay, are we all good with this? Because that would be a violation of the OPMA, even in an executive session.
That would
Which means that you don't have consensus. So you come back out of that room and you look like a bunch of idiots because you couldn't figure out which one candidate you wanted.
No,
You got the name.
I disagree with the premise that you come out looking like idiots.
Really?
I do, actually.
I've been in that situation.
Have you dealt with him?
Have you ever dealt with that?
No, and I've seen it play out 2 ways. And also, I've seen a board chair come out while we were in executive session. We made this decision. Obviously, no, that's bad. And versus the board chair coming out, we went to executive session to evaluate each of the individual's qualifications, and have the right to. We didn't compare them. We have made no decisions on who to hire, and get ahead of we didn't pick anybody, because the second you come out saying this is our preferred candidate, you've got a problem.
So let me help you with this. So who's BSing who? Because if you come out and say, well, I didn't, no, we didn't make a decision, but you did. Because now you're voting. That's what you're doing in the room. You're trying to figure out who's the best candidate to come in an appointed position that has to run for election within a year or 2. And what you're trying to do is get the best person that you can to represent the district. And the only way you do that, you got to be able to discuss and come to a consensus out of the 6 candidates, who's the best to serve the community. And if you come out there and say, we didn't discuss this, but we want him, we always go.
See, I guess there's where the idea of that. So you evaluate all 6 applicants. You talked about, 3 people just decided they want the red hat. They have no history, no qualifications at all. But you have 2 that are strong candidates. And you have this, so the discussion is, this is the candidate A, all this experience, she's worked all these places, she's been EMT, she's been assistant chief, blah, blah, blah. And then you have this other one, similar, almost, very similar qualifications. Then you come back into open session and say, okay, let's talk about we've talked about their qualifications. Now let's talk about who we're actually going to appoint to the position and why. Because it's that piece that people get to see, why it's the decision-making process of, who are we going to pick. And I guarantee, if sometimes it does come out where there's a vote, say I make this motion, and it's, because it's the way it plays out. Other times it's been really good discussions around that exact issue. And about, people fairly strongly for candidate A, people fairly strongly for candidate B, and then there's a robust discussion as to why one is the better candidate. That's what's supposed to happen in open session.
Or you blindfold everybody and take them to the elephant and show them 2 ends of the elephant and see which one they. Just saying, that's kind of, sometimes you need to have the discussion, and the legislature does. You have open discussions, but also if you have people that are coming in that are applying for a position. So you want to come out of the room and say, that guy sucks and this guy is good, that guy sucks, this guy is good. And an open discussion. I mean, that's always the thing that gets me, is that I understand the open, don't check my where I'm from and start checking what meetings I go to.
Yeah, get rid of that.
But it just cracks me up because sometimes you need to have those confidential conversations to come out with an opinion, because if all of a sudden you don't know how people are going to vote, you may not fill that position. And then the community doesn't.
And the issue is you cannot come out with, you can't make that decision in executive
They
session.
can't do it in executive.
And so in this, whether you call it let's take a vote in executive session, or whether you start having the conversation about, hey, do we really think Morgan is the best person for this position? You've gone too far.
Yes.
And you're trying to reach that consensus. That decision-making has to happen in open session. I respect the idea of, you want to look, professional and well thought out, but that's, and when you get back in, but part of it is there's an expectation that those discussions happen in open session, so people can say why we think Morgan's better.
I understand.
So.
That was just venting.
Is there any questions or any more venting to take place?
Thanks, Morgan.
Thank you.
Not seeing any more. Right?
Well, thank you for inviting, you got to see the last slide. Thank you for inviting me to spend a little time with you and talking through this. And thank you for the question. I'd rather have conversations than, just me talking the entire time, but thank you. Appreciate it.
If you got some more time, we can.
Yeah. All right, Mr. Nelson, item number 6 on our list, the administrative update.
Okay. Outreach. The State Council of Firefighters is having their annual convention at the end of the month, June 25th through the 27th in Vancouver. We will have a table there and some team members there to answer questions throughout the convention. And then the other item I wanted to mention is the board newsletter. Obviously, the rate setting that you'll be doing at your July meeting will be a key topic. So turnaround might be quick, but the plan is to have that newsletter out in August following the July meeting, which, by the way, the next meeting is July 24th, back on a Wednesday again instead of on a Monday. So I apologize if having this meeting on a Monday is now going to mess you guys up for the rest of the week, like it will me. But that's all I had for the admin update. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? Okay, thanks, Steve. The last item on our list, and got Morgan sitting in the room still, so I'm kind of all balled up on this one now. It sounds like we should have done this at the very beginning, but it's.
I made a note.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Well, let me just read my highlighted section. The Left 2 board welcomes public comment in advance of all meetings and has posted instruction on its website for the submission of written comments. And staff has received no comments in advance of today's meeting for distribution to the board. So therefore, we have no public comment. How do they do, Morgan? Thumbs up? All right, all right.
You did, it was the magic words in advance of the meeting.
In advance.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. And we don't have anybody online right now either, so I did look, so. All right, is there anything else before the group? Before we adjourn? You got a story? You crack it. Entertain a motion to adjourn? Is there a second? Motion's been made and seconded to adjourn. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? All right, we are adjourned. Thank you very much. Yeah, so your question. No.
Yeah, make sure.